VII. Prince of Valsassina. As Bellarion had calculated and disposed, so things fell out, and Filippo Maria Visconti in the 22nd year of his age led to the altar the widowed Countess of Biandrate who was 39. As a young girl, she had married, at the bidding of ambition, a man who was 20 years her senior. As a middle-aged woman now, and for the same reason, she married one who was almost as much her junior. She had not the foresight to perceive that the grievance on the score of disparity of years which she had nursed against Ficino would be nursed against herself to her ultimate destruction by this sly, furtive, and cruel prince to whom now she gave herself and her vast possessions. That, however, is no part of the story I have set myself to tell. Ettore Visconti defended in vain his usurped dominion against John Maria's legitimate successor. Filippo Maria, with Carmagnola in command of some 7,000 men, laid siege to Milan, whilst Bellarion went north to make an end of the Bergamo resistance. Because in haste to have done, he granted Malatesta easy terms of surrender, permitting him to ride out of the city with the honors of war, lance on thigh. Thereafter, having restored order in Bergamo and left there a strong garrison under an officer of trust, he marched with the main army to join Filippo Maria who was conducting operations from the mills on Monte Luperio, 3 miles from Milan. Some 4 weeks already had he spent there, with little progress made. Ettore had enrolled and constrained to the defense of the city almost every man of an age to bear arms. It was necessary to make an end, and Bellarion himself with a few followers entered the castle of Porta Giovia which was being held against Ettore by Vimercati, the Castellan. From its walls, having attracted the people by trumpet blast, he published Filippo Maria's proclamation, wherein the prince solemnly undertook that if the city were at once surrendered to him it should have nothing to fear. That there should be no pillage, executions, or other measures punitive of this resistance to the state's legitimate lord. The news flew in every direction, with the result that before nightfall all those whom Ettore had constrained to follow him had fallen away, and he was left with only his mercenaries. With these, next morning, he hacked a way out through the Comasina gate as the people were throwing open to the new duke the gates of the city on the other side. Filippo Maria entered with a comparatively small following and in the wake of a train of bread carts sent ahead to relieve the famine which already was beginning to press upon the inhabitants. The acclamations of "Live the Duke" quieted his natural timidity as he rode through the streets to shut himself up in the castle of Porta Giovia, which remained ever afterwards his residence. Not for Filippo Maria the palace of the old Broletto or the gaiety of courts. His dark, scheming, yet pusillanimous nature craved the security of a stronghold. For assisting him to the ducal throne, and no doubt to ensure their continued support, he rewarded his captains generously, and none more generously than Bellarion to whom he considered that he owed everything. Bellarion was not only confirmed in the lordship of Valsassina in feud, for himself and his heirs forever, but the duke raised the fief into a principality. Bellarion remained the duke's marshal-in-chief and military adviser. And it was by the dispositions which he made during that summer and autumn of 1412 that the lands of the duchy were finally cleared of the insurgent brigands who had renewed their depredations. Peace being restored at home, and industry being liberated at last from the trammels that had lain upon it since the death of John Galeazzo, prosperity flowed swiftly back to the state of Milan, and the people heaped blessings upon the shy, furtive ruler of whom they saw so little. It is possible that Filippo Maria would have been content to rest for the present upon what was done, to leave the frontiers of the duchy as he found them, and to dismiss the greater part of the costly condottas in his employ. But Bellarion at his elbow goaded him to further enterprise, and met his sluggish reluctance with a culminating argument that shamed him into action. Will you leave, in tranquil possession, the brigands who have encroached upon the glorious patrimony built up by your illustrious father? Will you dishonor his memory and be false to your name, Lord Duke? Thus, and similarly, Bellarion, with a heat that was purely histrionic. He cared no more for the integrity of John Galeazzo's patrimony than he cared for that of the Kingdom of England. What he cared for was that the order to dispossess those tyrants would sound the knell of Theodore of Montferrat. Thus, at last, should he be enabled to complete the service, to which 5 years ago he had dedicated himself, and to which unfalteringly, if obscurely and tortuously, he had held. Very patiently had he waited for this hour, when, yielding at last to his bold importunities, the Duke summoned a council of the officers of state and the chief condottieri to determine the order in which action should be taken. At once Bellarion urged that a beginning should be made by recovering Vercelli, than which few strongholds were of more importance to the safety of the duchy. It provoked a protest from Beccaria, who was the Duke's minister of state. An odd proposal this from you, Lord Bellarion, remembering that it was by your own action in concert with the Count of Biandrate that the Marquis Theodore was placed in possession of Vercelli. Bellarion crushed him with his logic. Not odd, sir, natural. Then I was on the other side. And if, being on the other side, I conceived it important that Theodore should hold Vercelli, now that I am opposed to him I conceive it equally important that he should be driven from it. There was a pause. Filippo Maria, somnolent in his great chair, looked round the group. What is the military view? He asked. He had noticed that not one of the captains had voiced an opinion. He was answered now by the burly Königshofen. I have no views that are not Bellarion's. I have followed him long enough to know that he's a safe man to follow. Giasone Trotta, uninvited, expressed the same sentiment. Filippo Maria turned to Carmagnola, who sat silent and thoughtful. And you, sir? He asked. Carmagnola reared his blond head, and Bellarion braced himself for battle. But to his amazement, for once, for the first time in their long association, Carmagnola was on his side. I am of Bellarion's mind, magnificent. We who were with my lord Facino when he made alliance with Theodore of Montferrat know Theodore for a crafty, daring man of boundless ambition. His occupation of Vercelli is a menace to the peace of the duchy. After that the other captains, Valperga and Marsilio, who had been wavering, threw in their votes, so that the military opinion was solidly unanimous. Filippo Maria balanced the matter for a moment. You are not forgetting, sirs, that for Theodore's good behavior I have in my hands a precious hostage, in the person of his nephew, the Marquis John Giacomo, in whose name Theodore rules. You laugh, Bellarion. That hostage was procured to ensure, not the good faith of Theodore, but the safety of the real Prince of Montferrat. Carmagnola has told your magnificence that Theodore is crafty, daring, and ambitious. It is a part of his ambition to make himself absolute sovereign where at present he is no more than regent. Let your magnificence judge if the thought of harm to the hostage you hold would be a deterrent to him. A while still they debated. Then Filippo Maria announced that he would take thought and make known his decision when it was reached. On that he dismissed them. As they went from the council chamber the captains witnessed the phenomenon of a yet closer unity between Bellarion and Carmagnola. The new Prince of Valsassina linked arms with Francesco Busone, and drew him away. You will do a service in this matter, Ser Francesco, if you send word to Lady Valeria and her brother urging them to come at once to Milan and petition the Duke to place John Giacomo upon his throne. He is of full age, and only his absence from Montferrat enables Theodore to continue in the regency. Carmagnola looked at him suspiciously. Why do you not send that message, yourself? Bellarion shrugged and spread his hands a little. I have not the confidence of the princess. A message from me might be mistrusted. Carmagnola's fine blue eyes pondered him still with that suspicious glance. What game do you play? He asked. I see that you mistrust me, too. I ever have done. It's a compliment, said Bellarion. If it is, I don't perceive it. If you did, you wouldn't pay it. You are direct, Carmagnola, and for that I honor you. I am not direct, and yet you may come to honor me for that too when you understand it, if you ever do. You ask what game I play. A game which began long ago, in which this is the last move. The alliance I brought about between Facino and Theodore was a move in this game, the securing of the person of John Giacomo of Montferrat as a hostage was another. To make it possible for Theodore to occupy Vercelli and make himself lord of Genoa, yet another. My only aim was to unbridle his greed so that he should become a menace to the duchy, against such a day as this, when on the Duke's side it is my duty to advise his definite destruction." Carmagnola's eyes were wide, amazement overspread his florid handsome face. "By the bones of Saint Ambrose, you play mighty deep." Bellarion smiled. "I am frank with you. I explain myself. It is tedious but necessary so as to conquer your mistrust and procure your cooperation. To make me a pawn in this game of yours. That is to describe yourself unflatteringly. Francesco Busone of Carmagnola is no man's pawn. No, by God. I am glad you perceive that. Should I have explained myself if I did not?" said Bellarion to assure him of a fact of which clearly he was far from sure. "Tell me why you so schemed and plotted." Bellarion sighed. "To amuse myself, perhaps. It interests me. Ficino said of me that I was a natural strategist. This broader strategy upon the great field of life gives scope to my inclinations." He was thoughtful, chin in hand. "I do not think there is more in it than that." And abruptly he asked, "You'll send that message?" Carmagnola too considered. There was a dream that he had dreamed, a game that he could play, making in his turn a pawn of this crafty brother captain who sought to make a pawn of him. "I'll go to Melegnano in person," he announced. He went, and there dispelled the fretful suspense in which the Princess Valeria waited for a justice of which she almost despaired. He dealt in that directness which was the only thing Bellarion found to honor in him. But the directness now was in his manner only. "Lady, I come to bid you take a hand in your own and your brother's reinstatement. Your petition to the Duke is all that is needed now to persuade him to the step which I have urged, to march against the usurper Theodore and cast him out." It took her breath away. "You have urged this? You, my lord? Let me send for my brother that he may thank you, that he may know that he has at least one stout brave friend in the world. His friend and your servant, Madonna." He bore her white hand to his lips, and there were tears in her eyes as she looked upon his bowed handsome head. "My hopes, my plans, my schemes for you are to bear fruit at last." "Your schemes for me?" Her brows were knit over her moist dark eyes. He laughed. A jovial, debonair, and laughter-loving gentleman, this Francesco Busone of Carmagnola. So as to provide a cause disposing the Duke of Milan to proceed against the Regent Theodore. The hour has come, Madonna. It needs but your petition to Filippo Maria, and the army marches. So that I command it, I will see justice done to your brother. So that you command it? Who else should? Carmagnola's bright face was overcast. "There is Bellarion Kane. That knave." She recoiled, her countenance troubled. "He is the regent's man. It was he who helped the regent to Vercelli and to the lordship of Genoa. Which he never could have done," Carmagnola assured her, "but that I abetted him. I saw that thus I should provide a reason for action against the regent when later I should come to be on the Duke's side." Ah! That was shrewd. To feed his ambition until he overreached himself. Carmagnola strutted a little. It was a deep game. But we are at the last move in it. If you mistrust this Bellarion, mistrust him. She laughed a bitter little laugh, and she poured forth the tale of how once he had been a spy sent by Theodore to embroil her, and how thereafter he had murdered her one true and devoted friend Count Spigno. Feeding her mistrust and bringing John Giacomo fully to share it, Carmagnola conducted them to Milan and procured audience for them with the Duke. Filippo Maria received her in a small room in the very heart of the fortress, a room to which he had brought something of the atmosphere of his library at Pavia. Here were the choicely bound manuscripts, and the writing table with its sheaves of parchment, and its horn of unicorn, which as all the world knows is a prophylactic against all manner of ills of the flesh and the spirit. Its double window looked out upon the court of San Donato where the October sunshine warmed the red brick to the color of the rose. He gave her a kindly welcome, then settled into the inscrutable inertia of an obese Eastern idol whilst she made her prayer to him. When it was done he nodded slowly, and dispatched his secretary in quest of the Prince of Valsassina. The name conveyed nothing to her, for she had not heard of Bellarion's latest dignity. You shall have my decision later, Madonna. It is almost made already, and in the direction you desire. When I have conferred with the Prince of Valsassina upon the means at our command, I will send for you again. Meanwhile the Lord of Carmagnola will conduct you and your brother to my Duchess, whom it will delight to care for you. He cleared his throat. You have leave to go, he added in his shrill voice. They bowed, and were departing, when the returning secretary, opening the door, and holding up the arras that masked it, announced, the Prince of Valsassina. He came in erect and proud of bearing, for all that he still limped a little. His tunic was of black velvet edged with dark brown fur, a heavy gold chain hung upon his breast, a girdle of beaten gold gripped his loins and carried his stout dagger. His hose were in white and blue stripes. From the threshold he bowed low to the prince and then to Madonna Valeria, who was staring at him in sudden panic. She curtsied to him almost despite herself, and then made haste to depart with Carmagnola and her brother. But there was a weight of lead in her breast. If action against Theodore depended upon this man's counsel, what hope remained? She put that question to Carmagnola. He quieted her fears. After all, he is not omnipotent. Our fealty is not to him, but to the Duchess Beatrice. Win her to your side, and things will shape the course you desire, especially if I command the enterprise. And meanwhile this man whom she mistrusted was closeted with the Duke, and the Duke was informing him of this new factor in their plans against Montferrat. She desires us to break a lance in her brother's behalf. But Montferrat is loyal to Theodore. They have no opinion there of John Giacomo, and to impose by force of arms a prince upon a people is perhaps to render that people hostile to ourselves. If that were so, and I confess that I do not share your potency's apprehensions, it would still be the course I should presume to advise. In Theodore you have a neighbor whom ambition makes dangerous. In John Giacomo you have a mild and gentle youth, whose thoughts, since his conversion from debauchery, turn rather to religion than to deeds of arms. Place him upon the throne of his fathers, and you have in such a man not only a friendly neighbor but a grateful servant. Ha! You believe in gratitude, Bellarion? I must, since I practice it. There followed that night a council of the captains, and since they were still nominally regarded as in the service of Ficino's widow, the Duchess herself attended it. And since the fortunes of the legitimate ruler of Montferrat was one of the issues, the Marquis John Giacomo and his sister were also invited to be present. The Duke, at the head of the long table, with the Duchess on his right and Bellarion on his left, made known the intention to declare war immediately upon the regent of Montferrat upon two grounds, his occupation of the Milanese stronghold and lands of Vercelli, and his usurpation of the regency beyond the Marquis John Giacomo's attainment of full age. Of his captains now he desired an account of the means at their disposal, and afterwards a decision of those to be employed in the undertaking. Carmagnola came prepared with a computation of the probable forces which Theodore could levy. And they were considerable, not less than 5,000 men. The necessary force to deal with him was next debated, having regard also to certain other enterprises to which Milan was elsewhere committed. At length this was fixed by Bellarion. It was to consist of the Germans under Königshofen, Stoffel's Swiss, Giasone Trotta's Italian mercenaries, and Marsilio's Condotta, amounting in all to some 7,000 men. That would leave free for other eventualities the Condottas of Valperga and of Carmagnola with whom were Ercole Belluno and Ugolino de Tenda. Against this, and on the plea that the Duke might require the services of the Prince of Valsassina at home, Carmagnola begged that the enterprise against Montferrat should be confided to his leadership. His own Condotta taking the place of Bellarion's, but all else remaining as Bellarion disposed. The Duke, showing in his pale face no sign of his surprise at this request, looked from Carmagnola to Bellarion, appearing to ponder, what time the Princess Valeria held her breath. At length the Duke spoke. Have you anything to say to that, Valsassina? Nothing if your Highness is content. You will remember that Theodore of Montferrat is one of the most skilful captains of the day, and if this business is not to drag on unduly, indeed if it is to be brought to a successful issue, you would do well to send against him of your best. A sly smile broke upon that sinisterly placid countenance. By which you mean yourself. For my part, said Königshofen, I do not willingly march under another. And for mine, said Stoffel, whilst Bellarion lives I do not march under another at all. The Duke looked at Carmagnola. You hear, sir. Carmagnola flushed uncomfortably. I had set my heart upon the enterprise, Lord Duke. The Princess Valeria interposed. By your leave, Highness, does my vote count for anything in this matter? Assuredly, Madonna. Your own and your brother's. Then, Lord Duke, my vote, indeed my prayer, is that my Lord of Carmagnola be given the command. The Duchess raised her long eyes to look at her in wonder. Bellarion sat inscrutable. The request wounded without surprising him. He knew her unconquerable mistrust of him. He had hoped in the end which was now approaching to prove to her its cruel injustice. But if occasion for that were denied him, it would be no great matter. What signified was that her own aims should be accomplished, and, after all, they were not beyond the strength and skill of Carmagnola, who had his talents as a leader when all was said. The Duke's lackluster eyes were steadily upon Valeria. He spoke after a pause. Almost you imply a doubt of the Prince of Valsassina's capacity. Not of his capacity. Oh, not of that. Of what, then? The question troubled her. She looked at her brother, and her brother answered for her. My sister remembers that the Prince of Valsassina was once the Marquis Theodore's friend. Was he so? When was that? The Duke looked at Bellarion, but it was John Giacomo who answered the question. When, in alliance with him, he placed him in possession of Vercelli and Genoa. The alliance was the Lord Ficino's, not Valsassina's. Bellarion served under him. But so also did Carmagnola. Where is the difference between them? My Lord of Carmagnola acted then with a view to my brother's ultimate service, the princess answered. If he was a party to the Marquis Theodore's occupation of Vercelli, it was only so that in that act the Marquis might provide a cause for the action that is now proposed against him by the Duke of Milan. Bellarion laughed softly at the light he suddenly perceived. Do you mock that statement, sir? Carmagnola challenged him. Do you dare to say what was in my mind at the time? I have honored you for directness, Carmagnola. But it seems you can be subtle too. Subtle. Carmagnola flushed indignantly. In what have I been subtle? In the spirit in which you favored Theodore's occupation of Vercelli, said Bellarion, and so left him gaping foolishly. What else did you think I had in mind? He smiled almost ingenuously into the other's face. The Duke rapped the table. Sirs, sirs. We wander. And there is this matter to resolve. Bellarion answered him. Here, then, is a solution your highness may be disposed to adopt. Instead of Valperga and his troops, I take with me Carmagnola and his own condotta which is of a similar strength, and, like Valperga's, mainly horse. Thus we march together, and share the enterprise. But unless Bellarion commands it, Lord Duke, your highness will graciously consider sending another condotta in the place of mine, said Königshofen, and Stoffel was about to add his own voice to that, when the Duke losing patience broke in. Peace. Peace. I am Duke of Milan, and I give orders here. You are summoned to advise, not to browbeat me and say what you will and will not do. Let it be done as Valsassina says, since Carmagnola has set his heart upon being in the campaign. But Valsassina leads the enterprise. The matter is closed on that. You have leave to go. 8. Carmagnola's bridges. Dissensions at the very outset between Carmagnola and Bellarion protracted by some days the preparations for the departure of the army. This enabled Theodore of Montferrat fully to make his dispositions for resistance, to pack the granaries of Vercelli and otherwise victual it for a siege, and to increase the strong body of troops already under his hand, with which he threw himself into the menaced city. Further, By working furiously during those October days, he was enabled to strengthen his bastions and throw up fresh earthworks, from which to shatter the onslaught when it should come. Upon these very circumstances of which Bellarion and his captains were duly informed followed fresh dissensions. Carmagnola advocated that operations should be begun by the reduction of Montferrat, which was being held for Theodore, and which, if not seized before they marched upon Vercelli, would constitute, he argued, a menace upon their rear. Bellarion's view was that the menace was not sufficiently serious to merit attention, that whilst they were reducing it, Theodore would further be strengthening himself at Vercelli. And that, in short, they should march straight upon Vercelli, depending that, when they forced it to a capitulation, Montferrat would thereby be scared into immediate surrender. Of the captains some held one view, some the other. Königshofen, Stoffel, and Trotta took sides with Bellarion. Ercole Belluno, who commanded the foot in Carmagnola's condotta, took sides with his leader as did also Ugolino de Tenda who captained 1,000 horse. Yet Bellarion would have overruled them but for the Princess Valeria who with her brother entered now into all their councils. These were on the side of Carmagnola. Hence a compromise was effected. A detachment under Königshofen including Trotta's troops was to go against Montferrat, to cover the rear of the main army proceeding to Vercelli. To Vercelli that army, now not more than some 4,000 strong, yet strong enough in Bellarion's view for the task in hand, made at last a speedy advance. But at Borgo Vercelli they were brought to a halt by the fact that Theodore had blown up the bridge over the Sesia, leaving that broad, deep, swift-flowing river between the enemy and the city which was their goal. At Carpignano, 20 miles higher up, there was a bridge which Bellarion ascertained had been left standing. He announced that they must avail themselves of that. 20 miles there, and 20 miles back, snorted Carmagnola. It is too much. A weariness and a labor. I'll not dispute it. But the alternative is to go by way of Casale, which is even farther. The alternative, Carmagnola answered, is to bridge the Sesia and the Serva above their junction where the Sesia is narrower. Our lines of communication with the army at Montferrat should be as short as possible. You begin to perceive one of the disadvantages of having left that army at Montferrat. It is no disadvantage if we make proper provision. And you think that your bridges will afford that provision. Bellarion's manner was almost supercilious. Carmagnola resented it. Can you deny it? I can do more. I can foresee what will happen. Sometimes, Francesco, you leave me wondering where you learnt the art of war, or however you came to engage in it. They held their discussion in the kitchen of a peasant's house which for the Princess Valeria's sake they had invaded. And the princess and her brother were its only witnesses. When Carmagnola now moved wrathfully in great strides about the dingy chamber, stamping upon the earthen floor and waving his arms as he began to storm, one of those witnesses became an actor to calm him. The Princess Valeria laid a hand upon one of those waving arms in its gorgeous sleeve of gold-embroidered scarlet. Do not heed his taunts, Messer Carmagnola. You have my utter trust and confidence. It is my wish that you should build your bridges. Bellarion tilted his chin to look at her between anger and amusement. If you are to take command, Highness, I'll say no more. He bowed, and went out. One of these days I shall give that upstart dog a lesson in good manners, said Carmagnola between his teeth. The princess shook her head. It is not his manners, sir, that trouble me, but his possible aims. If I could trust him. If you could trust his loyalty, you should still mistrust his skill. Yet he has one great repute as a soldier, put in John Giacomo, who instinctively mistrusted the Thrasonical airs of the swaggering Carmagnola, and mistrusted still more his fawning manner towards Valeria. He has been fortunate, Carmagnola answered, and his good fortune has gone to his head. Meanwhile Bellarion went straight from that interview to dispatch Werner von Stoffel with 500 arbalesters and 600 horse to Carpignano. There was a fresh breeze with Carmagnola when the latter discovered this. He demanded to know why it should have been done without previous consultation with himself and the princess, and Valeria was beside him when he asked the question. Bellarion's answer was a very full one. You will be a week building your bridges. In that time it may occur to Theodore to do what he should have done already, to destroy the bridge at Carpignano. And what do I care about the bridge at Carpignano when I shall have bridges of my own here? When you have bridges of your own here, you need not care. But I have a notion that it will be longer than you think before you have these bridges, and that we may have to go by way of Carpignano in the end. I shall have my bridges in a week, said Carmagnola. Bellarion smiled. When you have them, and when you have put 2,000 men across to hold them, I'll bid Stoffel return from Carpignano. But in the meantime. Bellarion interrupted him, and suddenly he was very stern. In the meantime you will remember that I command. Though I may choose to humor you and her highness, as the shortest way to convince you of error, yet I do not undertake to obey you against my better judgment. By God, Bellarion. Carmagnola swore at him, I'll not have you gay with me. You'll measure your words, or else you'll eat them. Very coldly Bellarion looked at him, and observed Valeria's white restraining hand which again was upon Carmagnola's sleeve. At the moment I have a task in hand to which I belong entirely. While it is doing, if you forget that I command, I shall remove you from the army. He left the swaggerer fuming. Only my regard for you, Madonna, restrains me, he assured the princess. He takes that tone when he should remember that, if it came to blows between us, the majority of the men here would be upon my side, now that he has sent nearly all his own away. He clenched his hands in anger. Yet for your sake, lady, I must suffer it. There can be no quarrel between his men and mine until we have placed you and your brother in possession of Montferrat. These and other such professions of staunch selfless loyalty touched her deeply. And in the days that followed, whilst the troopers, toiling like woodmen, were felling trees and building the bridges above the junction of the rivers, Carmagnola and Valeria were constantly together. She was driven now to the discomfort of living under canvas, sharing the camp life of these rude men of war, and Carmagnola did all in his power to mitigate for her the hardships it entailed, hardships which she bore with a high gay courage. She would go with him daily to watch the half-naked laborers in the river, bundling together whole trees as if they were mere twigs, to serve as pontoons. And daily he gave her cause to admire his skill, his ingenuity, and his military capacity. That Bellarion should have sneered at this was but another proof of Bellarion's worthlessness. Either he could not understand it, or else of treacherous intent he desired to deprive her of its fruits. Meanwhile Carmagnola beglamored her with talk of actions past, in all of which he played ever the heroic part. The eyes of her mind were dazzled by the pictures his words drew for her. Now she beheld him leading a knightly charge that shattered an enemy host into shards, now she saw him at the head of an escalade, indomitably climbing enemy walls under a hail of stones and scalding pitch. Now she saw him in council, wisely planning the means by which victory might be snatched from overwhelming opposition. One day when he spoke of these things, as they sat alone watching the men who swarmed like ants about the building of his bridge, he touched a closer note. Yet of all the enterprises to which I have set these rude, soldier hands, none has so warmed me as this, for none has been worthier a man's endeavor. It will be a glorious day for me when we set you in your palace at Casale. A glorious day, and yet a bitter. A bitter. Her great dark eyes turned on him in question. His countenance clouded, his own glance fell away. Will it not be bitter for me to know this service is at an end, to know that I must go my ways? Resume a mercenary's life, and do for hire that which I now do out of enthusiasm and love? She shifted her own glance, embarrassed a little. Surely you do yourself less than justice. There is great honor and fame in store for you, my lord. Honor and fame. He laughed. I would gladly leave those to tricksters like Bellarion, who rise to them so easily because no scruples ever deter them. Honor and fame. Let who will have those, so that I may serve where my heart bids me. Boldly now his hand sought hers. She let it lie in his. Above those pensive, mysterious eyes her fine brows were knit. Aye, she breathed, that is the great service of life. That is the only worthy service, as the heart bids. His second hand came to recruit the first. Lying almost at her feet, he swung round on his side upon the green earth, looking up at her in a sort of ecstasy. You think that, too? You help me to self-contempt, Madonna. To self-contempt? It is the only contempt that you will ever know. But why should you know that? Because all my life, until this moment, I have served for hire. Because, if this adventure had not come to me by God's grace, in such worthless endeavors would my life continue. Now that I know the opinion in which you must hold such service, it is over and done for me. When I shall have served you to your goal, I shall have performed my last. There fell a long pause between them. At last, when my brother is crowned in Casale, he will need a servant such as you, Messer Carmagnola. But shall you, Madonna? Shall you? She looked at him wistfully, smiling a little. He was very handsome, very splendid and very brave, a knight to win a lady's trust, and she was a very lonely, friendless lady in sore need of a stout arm and a gallant heart to help her through the trials of this life. The tapering fingers of her disengaged hand descended gently upon his golden head. Shall I not? She asked with a little tremulous laugh. Shall I not? Why, then, Madonna, if you will accept my service, it shall be yours for as long as I endure. It shall never be another's. Valeria. My Valeria. That hand upon his head, overheating its very indifferent contents, drove him now to an excessive precipitancy. He carried the hand he held almost fiercely to his lips. It was withdrawn, gently but firmly as was its fellow. His kiss and the bold use of her name scared her a little. Carmagnola, my friend. Your friend, and more than your friend, Madonna. Why, how much more can there be than that? All that a man may be to a woman, my Valeria. I am your knight. I ever have been since that day in the lists at Milan, when you bestowed the palm on me. I joy in this battle that is to be fought for you. I would joy in death for you if it were needed to prove my worship. How glibly you say these things. There will have been queens in other lists in which you have borne off the palm. Have you talked so to them? Oh cruelty, he cried out like a man in pain. That you should say this to me. I am swooning at your feet, Valeria, you wonder of the world. My nose, sir, is too long for that. She mocked him, but with an underlying tenderness, and tenderness there was too in her moist eyes. You are a whirlwind in your wooing as in the lists. You are reckless, sir. Is it a fault? A soldier's fault, then. But I'll be patient if you bid me. I'll be whatsoever you bid me, Valeria. But when we come to Casale. He paused for words, and she took advantage of that pause to check him. It is unlucky to plan upon something not yet achieved, sir. Wait until that time arrives. And then? He asked her breathlessly. And then? Have I not said that to plan is unlucky? Boldly he read the converse of that statement. I'll not tempt fortune, then. I dare not. I will be patient, Valeria. But he let it appear that his confidence was firm, and she added nothing now to shake it. And so in ardent wooing whilst he waited for his bridge, Carmagnola spent most of the time that he was not engaged in directing the construction of it. Bellarion in those days sulked like Achilles in his tent, with a copy of VIII which he had brought from Milan in his baggage. The bridges took, not a week, but 11 days to build. At last, however, on the eve of All Saints, as Fra Serafino tells us, Carmagnola accompanied by Valeria and her brother bore word himself to Bellarion that the bridges were ready and that a party of 50 of his men were encamped on the peninsula between the rivers. He came to demand that Bellarion should so dispose that the army should begin to cross at dawn. That, said Bellarion, assumes that your bridges endure until dawn. He was standing, where he had risen to receive his visitors, in the middle of his roomy pavilion, which was lighted by a group of 3 lanterns hung at the height of his head on the tent pole. The book in which he had been reading was closed upon his forefinger. Endure until dawn. Carmagnola was annoyed by the suggestion. What do you mean? Bellarion's remark had been imprudent. Still more imprudent was the laugh he now uttered. Ask yourself who should destroy them, he said. In your place I should have asked myself that before I went to the trouble of building them. How should Theodore know of it, shut up as he is in Vercelli, 8 miles away? Part of his question was answered on the instant by a demoniac uproar from the strip of land across the water. Cries of rage and terror, shouts of encouragement and command, the sound of blows, and all the unmistakable din of conflict, rose fiercely upon the deepening gloom. He knows, it seems, said Bellarion, and again he laughed. Carmagnola stood a moment, clenching and unclenching his hands, his face white with rage. Then he span round where he stood and with an inarticulate cry dashed from the tent. One withering glance Valeria flashed into Bellarion's sardonically amused countenance, then, summoning her brother, she followed Carmagnola. Bellarion set down his book upon the table by the tent pole, took up a cloak, and followed them at leisure, through the screen of bare trees behind which his pavilion had been pitched, and along the high bank of the swirling river towards the head of Carmagnola's bridge. There, as he expected, he found them, scarcely visible in the gloom, and with them a knot of men-at-arms and a half-dozen stragglers, all that had escaped of the party that Carmagnola had sent across an hour ago. The others had been surrounded and captured. Last of all to win across, arriving just as Bellarion reached the spot, was Belluno, who had commanded them, an excitable Neapolitan who leapt up the bank from the bridge ranting by all the patrons of Naples that they had been betrayed. Over the river came a sound of tramping feet. Dimly reflected in the water they could see the forms of men who otherwise moved invisible on the farther bank, and presently came a sound of axes on timber. There goes your bridge, Francesco, said Bellarion, and for the third time he laughed. Do you mock me, damn you? Carmagnola raged at him, and then raised his voice to roar for arbalesters. 3 or 4 of the men went off vociferously, at a run, to fetch them, whilst Valeria turned suddenly upon Bellarion, whose tall cloaked figure stood beside her. Why do you laugh? Her voice, sharp with disdain, resentment, and suspicion, silenced all there that they might hear his answer. I am human, I suppose, and, therefore, not entirely without malice. Is that all your reason? Is your malice so deep that you can laugh at an enemy advantage which may wreck the labor of days? And then with increasing sharpness and increasing accusation, you knew, she cried. You knew that the bridges would be destroyed tonight. Yourself, you said so. How did you know? How did you know? What are you implying, Madonna? Cried Carmagnola, aghast. For all his hostility towards Bellarion, he was very far from ready to believe that he played a double game. That I have no wits, said Bellarion, quietly scornful. And now the impetuous Belluno, smarting under his own particular misadventure and near escape, must needs cut in. Madonna is implying more than that. She is implying that you've sold us to Theodore of Montferrat. Are you implying it, too, Belluno? His tone had changed. There was now in his voice a note that the princess had never heard, a note that made Belluno's blood run cold. Speak out, man. Though I give license for innuendo to a lady, I require clear speech from every man. So let us have this thing quite plainly. Belluno was brave and obstinate. He conquered his fear of Bellarion sufficiently to make a show of standing his ground. It is clear, he answered sullenly, that we have been betrayed. How is it clear, you fool? Bellarion shifted again from cold wrath with an insubordinate inferior to argument with a fellow man. Are you so inept at the trade by which you live that you can conceive of a soldier in the Marquis Theodore's position neglecting to throw out scouts to watch the enemy and report his movements? Are you so much a fool as that? If so, I shall have to think of replacing you in your command. Carmagnola interposed aggressively. And this partly to protect Belluno, who was one of his own lieutenants, and partly because the sneer at the fellow's lack of military foresight was a reflection upon Carmagnola himself. Do you pretend that you foresaw this action of Theodore's? I pretend that any but a fool must have foreseen it. It is precisely what any soldier in his place would do, allow you to waste time, material, and energy on building bridges, and then promptly destroy them for you. Why, then, did you not say this 10 days ago? Why? Bellarion's voice sounded amused. His face they could not see. Because I never spend myself in argument with those who learn only by experience. Again the princess intervened. Is that the best reason you can give? You allowed time, material, and energy, and now even a detachment of men to be wasted, merely that you might prove his folly to my lord of Carmagnola. Is that what you ask us to believe? He thinks us credulous, by God, swore Carmagnola. Bellarion kept his patience. I had another reason, a military one with which it seems that I must shame your wits. To move the whole army from here to Carpignano would have taken me at least 2 days, perhaps 3. A mounted detachment from Vercelli to destroy the bridge could reach Carpignano in a few hours, and once it was seen that I moved my army thither that detachment would have been instantly dispatched. It was a movement I feared in any case, until your bridge-building operations here deceived Theodore into believing that I had no thought of Carpignano. That is why I allowed them to continue. Though your bridges could never serve the purpose for which you built them, they could excellently serve to disguise my own intention of crossing at Carpignano. Tomorrow, when the army begins to move thither, that detachment of Theodore's will most certainly be sent to destroy the bridge. But it will find it held by 1,000 men under Stoffel, and the probable capture of that detachment will compensate for the loss of men you have suffered tonight. There was a moment's utter silence when he had done, a silence of defeat and confusion. Then came an applauding splutter of laughter from the group of men and officers who stood about. It was cut short by a loud crash from across the stream, and, thereafter, with a groaning and rending of timbers, a gurgling of swelling, momentarily arrested, waters, and finally a noise like a thunderclap. The wrecked bridge swinging out into the stream snapped from the logs that held it to the northern shore. There it goes, Carmagnola, said Bellarion. But you no longer need bewail your labors. They have served my purpose. He cast his cloak more tightly about him, wished them good night almost gaily, and went striding away towards his pavilion. Carmagnola, crestfallen, swallowing his chagrin as best he could, stood there in silence beside the equally silenced princess. Belluno swore softly, and vented a laugh of some little bitterness. He's deep, always deep, by St. Januarius. Never does he do the things he seems to do. Never does he aim where he looks. 9. Vercelli. A letter survives which the Prince of Valsassina wrote some little time after these events to Duke Filippo Maria, in which occurs the following criticism of the captains of his day: they are stout fellows and great fighters, but rude, unlettered, and lacking culture. Their minds are fertile, vigorous soil, but unbroken by the plough of learning, so that the seeds of knowledge with which they are all too sparsely sown find little root there. At Carpignano, when they came there 3 days after breaking camp, they found that all had fallen out as Bellarion calculated. A detachment of horse 100 strong had been sent in haste with the necessary implements to destroy the bridge. That detachment Stoffel had surrounded, captured, disarmed, and disbanded. They crossed, and after another 3 days marching down the right bank of the Sesia they crossed the Servo just above Quinto, where Bellarion took up his quarters in the little castle owned there by the Lord Girolamo Prato, who was with Theodore in Vercelli. Here, too, were housed the princess and her brother and the Lord of Carmagnola, the latter by now recovered from his humiliation in the matter of his bridges to a state of normal self-complacency and arrogance. An 18th-century French writer on tactics, M. Devanequi, in his L'Art Militaire au Moyen Age, in the course of a lengthy comparison between the methods of Bellarion Cain and the almost equally famous Sir John Hawkwood, offers some strong adverse criticisms upon Bellarion's dispositions in the case of this siege of Vercelli. He considers that as a necessary measure of preparation Bellarion when at Quinto should have thrown bridges across the Sesia above and below the city, so as to maintain unbroken his lines of circumvallation. instead of contenting himself with ferrying a force across to guard the eastern approaches. This force, being cut off by the river, could, says M. Devanequi, neither be supported at need nor afford support. What the distinguished French writer has missed is the fact that, once engaged upon it, Bellarion was as little in earnest about the siege of Vercelli as he was about Carmagnola's bridges. The one as much as the other was no more than a strategic demonstration. From the outset, that is to say, from the time when arriving at Quinto he beheld the strong earthworks Theodore had thrown up, he realized that the place was not easily to be carried by assault. And it was within his knowledge that it was too well victualled to succumb to hunger save after a siege more protracted than he himself was prepared to impose upon it. But there was Carmagnola, swaggering and thrasonical in spite of all that had gone, and there was the Princess Valeria supporting the handsome condottiero with her confidence. And Carmagnola, not content that Bellarion should girdle the city, arguing reasonably enough that months would be entailed in bringing Theodore to surrender from hunger, was loud and insistent in his demands that the place be assaulted. Once again, as in the case of the bridges, Bellarion yielded to the other's overbearing insistence, went even the length of inviting him to plan and conduct the assaults. 3 of these were delivered, and all 3 repulsed with ease by an enemy that appeared to Bellarion to be uncannily prescient. After the 3rd repulse, the same suspicion occurred to Carmagnola, and he expressed it. Not, however, to Bellarion, as he should have done, but to the princess. "You mean," she said, "that someone on our side is conveying information to Theodore of our intentions?" They were alone together in the armory of the castle of Quinto whose pointed windows overlooked the river. It was normally a bare room with stone walls and a vaulted white ceiling up which crawled a troop of the rampant lions of the Prati crudely frescoed in a dingy red. Bellarion had brought to it some furnishings that made it habitable, and so it became the room they chiefly used. The princess sat by the table in a great chair of painted leather, faded but comfortable. She was wrapped in a long blue gown that was lined with lynx fur against the chill weather which had set in. Carmagnola, big and gaudy in a suit of the color of sulphur, his tunic reversed with black fur, his powerful yet shapely legs booted to the knee, strode to and fro across the room in his excitement. "It is what I begin to fear," he answered her, and resumed his pacing. A silence followed, and remained unbroken until he went to plant himself, his feet wide, his hands behind him, before the logs that blazed in the cavernous fireplace. She looked up and met his glance. "You know what I am thinking," he said. "I am wondering whether you may not be right, after all, in your suspicions." Gently she shook her head. "I dismissed them on that night when your bridges were destroyed." His vindication was so complete, what followed proved him so right, that I could suspect him no longer. He is just a mercenary fellow, fighting for the hand that pays. I trust him now because he must know that he can win more by loyalty than by treachery. He agreed, "You are right, my princess. You are always right. I was not right in my suspicions of him. So think no more of those." Standing as he did, he was completely screening the fire from her. She rose and crossed to it, holding out her hands to the blaze when he made room for her beside him. "I am chilled," she said. "As much, I think, by our want of progress as by these November winds." "Nay, but take heart, Valeria," he bade her. "The one will last no longer than the other. Spring will follow in the world and in your soul." She looked up at him, and found him good to look upon, so big and strong, so handsome and so confident. "It is heartening to have such a man as you for company in such days." He took her in his arms, a masterful, irresistible fellow. "With such a woman as you beside me, Valeria, I could conquer the world." A dry voice broke in upon that rapture, "You might make a beginning by conquering Vercelli." Starting guiltily apart, they met the mocking eyes of Bellarion who entered. He came forward easily, as handsome in his way as Carmagnola, but cast in a finer, statelier mold. "I should be grateful to you, Francesco, and so would her highness, if you would accomplish that. The world can wait until afterwards." And Carmagnola, to cover his confusion and Valeria's, plunged headlong into contention. I'd reduce Vercelli tomorrow if I had my way. Who hinders you? You do. There was that night attack. Oh, that, said Bellarion. Do you bring that up again? Will you never take my word for anything, I wonder? It is foredoomed to failure. Not if conducted as I would have it. He came forward to the table, swaying from the hips in his swaggering walk. He put his finger on the map that was spread there. If a false attack were made here, on the east, between the city and the river, so as to draw the besieged, a bold, simultaneous attack on the west might carry the walls. It might, said Bellarion slowly, and fell to considering. This is a new thought of yours, this false attack. It has its merits. You approve me for once. What condescension! Bellarion ignored the interruption. It also has its dangers. The party making the feint, and it will need to be a strong one or its real purpose will be guessed, might easily be thrust into the river by a determined sally. It will not come to that, Carmagnola answered quickly. You cannot say so much. Why not? The feint will draw the besieged in that direction, but before they can sally they will be recalled by the real attack striking on the other side. Bellarion pondered again, but finally shook his head. I have said that it has its merits, and it tempts me. But I will not take the risk. The risk of what? Carmagnola was being exasperated by that quiet, determined opposition. God's death. Take charge of the feint yourself, if you wish. I'll lead the storming party, and so that you do your part, I'll answer for it that I am inside the town before daybreak and that Theodore will be in my hands. Valeria had remained with her shoulders to them facing the fire. Bellarion's entrance, discovering her in Carmagnola's arms, had covered her with confusion, filled her with a vexation not only against himself but against Carmagnola also. From this there was no recovery until Carmagnola's words came now to promise a conclusion of their troubles far speedier than any she had dared to hope. You'll answer for it, said Bellarion. And if you fail? I will not fail. You say yourself that it is soundly planned. Did I say so much? Surely not. To be frank, I am more afraid of Theodore of Montferrat than of any captain I've yet opposed. Afraid, said Carmagnola, and sneered. Afraid, Bellarion repeated quietly. I don't charge like a bull. I like to know exactly where I am going. In this case, I have told you. Valeria slowly crossed to them. Make the endeavor, at least, Lord Prince, she begged him. He looked from one to the other of them. Between you, you distract me a little. And you do not learn, which is really sad. Well, have your way, Francesco. The adventure may succeed. But if it fails, do not again attempt to persuade me to any course through which I do not clearly see my way. Valeria in her thanks was nearer to friendliness than he had ever known since that last night at Casale. Those thanks he received with a certain chill austerity. It was to be Carmagnola's enterprise, and he left it to Carmagnola to make all the dispositions. The attempt was planned for the following night. It was to take place precisely at midnight, which at that time of year was the 7th hour, and the signal for launching the false attack was to be taken from the clock on San Vittore, one of the few clocks in Italy at that date to strike the hour. After an interval sufficient to allow the defenders to engage on that side, Carmagnola would open the real attack. Empanopled in his armor, and carrying his peaked helm in the crook of his arm, Carmagnola went to ask of the princess a blessing on his enterprise. She broke into expressions of gratitude. Do not thank me yet, he said. Before morning, God helping me, I shall lay the state of Montferrat at your feet. Then I shall ask your thanks. She flushed under his ardent gaze. I shall pray for you, she promised him very fervently, and laid a hand upon his steel brassard. He bore it to his lips, bowed stiffly, and clanked out of the room. Bellarion did not come to seek her. Lightly armed, with no more than back and breast and a steel cap on his head, he led out his men through the night, making a wide detour so that their movements should not be heard in Vercelli. Since mobility was of the first importance, he took with him only a body of some 800 horse. They filed along by the river to the east of the city, which loomed there a vast black shadow against the faintly irradiated sky. They took up their station, dismounted, unlimbered the scaling ladders which they had brought for the purposes of their demonstration, and waited. They were, as Bellarion calculated, close upon the appointed hour when at one point of the line there was a sudden commotion. A man had been caught who had come prowling forward, and who, upon being seized, demanded to be taken at once before their leader. Roughly they did as he required of them. And there in the dark, for they dared kindle no betraying light. Bellarion learnt that he was a loyal subject of the Duke of Milan who had slipped out of the city to inform them that the Marquis Theodore was advised of their attack and ready to meet it. Bellarion swore profusely, a rare thing in him who seldom allowed himself to be mastered by his temper. But his fear of Theodore's craft drove him now like a fiery spur. If Theodore was forewarned, who could say what countermeasures Theodore had not prepared? This came of lending ear to that bellowing calf Carmagnola. Fiercely he gave the order to mount. There was some delay in the dark, and whilst they were still being marshalled the bell of San Vittore told the 7th hour. Some moments after that were lost before they were spurring off to warn and withdraw Carmagnola. Even then it was necessary to go cautiously through the dark over ground now sodden by several days of rain. Before they were halfway round the din of combat burst upon the air. Theodore had permitted Carmagnola's men to reach and faggot the moat, and even to plant some ladders, before moving. Then he had thrown out his army, in 2 wings, one from the gate to the north, the other from a gate on the opposite side, and these 2 wings had swept round to charge Carmagnola in flank and to envelop him. 2 things only saved Carmagnola. In the first place, Theodore's counterattack was prematurely launched, before Carmagnola was sufficiently committed. In the second, Stoffel, taking matters into his own hands, and employing the infantry tactics advocated by Bellarion, drew off his men, and formed them up to receive the charge he heard advancing from the north. That charge cost Theodore a score of piked horses, and it failed to break through the bristling human wall that rose before it in the dark. Having flung the charge back, Stoffel formed his men quickly into the hedgehog, embracing within it all that he could compass of Carmagnola's other detachments, and in this formation proceeded to draw off. Intent upon saving all that he could from the disaster that was upon them. Meanwhile the other battle, issuing from the gate on the south and led by Theodore himself, had crashed into Carmagnola's own body, which Carmagnola and Belluno were vainly seeking to marshal. They might have made an end of that detachment, which comprised the best part of Bellarion's condotta, had not Bellarion with his 800 horse at last come up to charge the enemy rear. That was the saving stroke. Caught now between 2 masses, realizing that his counter-surprise had failed, and unable in the dark to attempt a fresh maneuver, Theodore ordered his trumpeters to sound the retreat. Each side accounted itself fortunate in being able to retire in good order. The arrest. In the armory of the castle of Quinto, Carmagnola paced like a caged panther, the half of his armor still hanging upon him. His blond head still encased in the close-fitting cap of blood-red velvet that served to protect it from the helmet. And as he paced, he ranted of treachery and other things to Valeria and John Giacomo of Montferrat, to the half-dozen captains who had returned to render with him the account of that galling failure. The princess occupied the big chair by the table, whilst her brother leaned upon the back of it. Beyond stood ranged Ugolino da Tenda, Ercole Belluno, Stoffel, and 3 others, their armor flashing in the golden light of the cluster of candles set upon the table. Over by the hearth in another high-backed chair sat Bellarion, still in his black corselet, his long legs in their mud-splashed boots stretched straight before him, his head cased in a close-fitting cap of peach-colored velvet. Disdainfully listening to Carmagnola's furious tirade. He guessed the bitterness in the soul of the boaster who had promised so much to achieve so little. Therefore he was patient with him for a while. But to all things there must be an end, and an end there was to Bellarion's patience. Talking men's nothing, Francesco, he broke in at last. It may prevent a repetition. There can be no repetition, because there will be no second attempt. I should never have permitted this but that you plagued me with your insistence. And I should have succeeded had you done your part, roared Carmagnola in fury, a vain, humiliated man reckless of where he cast the blame for his own failure. By God's life, that is why disaster overtook us. Had you delivered your own attack as was concerted between us, Theodore must have sent a force to meet it. Bellarion remained calm under the accusation, and under the eyes of that company, all reproachful save Stoffel's. The Swiss, unable to contain himself, laughed aloud. If the Lord Bellarion had done that, sir, you might not now be alive. It was his change of plan, and the charge he delivered upon Theodore's rear, that enabled us to extricate ourselves, and so averted a disaster that might have been complete. And whilst you are noticing that fact, said Bellarion, it may also be worthy of your attention that if Stoffel had not ranged his foot to receive the charge from Theodore's right wing, and afterwards formed a hedgehog to encircle and defend you, you would not now be ranting here. It occurs to me that an expression of gratitude and praise for Stoffel would be not so much gracious as proper. Carmagnola glared. Ah, yes. You support each other. We are to thank you now for a failure, which your own action helped to bring about, Bellarion. Bellarion continued unruffled. The accusation impugns only your own intelligence. Does it so? Does it so? Ha! Where is this man who came, you say, to tell you that Theodore was forewarned of the attack? Bellarion shrugged. Do I know where he is? Do I care? Does it matter? A man comes to you out of the night with such a message as that, and you don't know what has become of him. I had other things to do than think of him. I had to think of you, and get you out of the trap that threatened you. And I say that you would have best done that by attacking on your own side, as we agreed. We never agreed that I should attack. But only that I should pretend to attack. I had not the means to push home an escalade. His suavity suddenly departed. But it seems to me that I begin to defend myself. He reached for his steel cap, and stood up. It becomes necessary, cried Carmagnola, who in 2 strides was at his side. Only that I should defend myself from a charge of rashness in having yielded to your insistence to attempt this night attack. There was a chance, I thought, of success, and since the alternative of starving the place would entail a delay of months, I took that chance. It has missed, and so forces me to a course I've been considering from the outset. Tomorrow I shall raise the siege. You'll raise the siege? That ejaculation of amazement came in chorus. Not only of Vercelli, but also of Mortera. You'll raise the siege, sir. It was John Giacomo who spoke now. And what then? That shall be decided tomorrow in council. It is almost daybreak. I'll wish you a good repose, Madonna, and you, sirs. He bowed to the company and moved to the door. Carmagnola put himself in his way. Ah, but wait, Bellarion. Tomorrow, Bellarion's voice was hard and peremptory. By then your wits may be cooler and clearer. If you will all gather here at noon, you shall learn my plans. Good night. And he went out. They gathered there, not at noon on the morrow, but an hour before that time, summoned by messages from Carmagnola, who was the last to arrive and a prey to great excitement. Belluno, de Tenda, Stoffel, and 3 other officers awaited him with the princess and the Marquis John Giacomo. Bellarion was not present. He had not been informed of the gathering, for reasons which Carmagnola's first words made clear to all. When Bellarion did arrive, punctually at noon, for the council to which he had bidden the captains, he was surprised to find them already seated about the table in debate and conducting this with a vehemence which argued that matters had already gone some way. Their voices raised in altercation reached him as he mounted the short flight of stone steps, at the foot of which a half-dozen men of Belluno's company were lounging. A silence fell when he entered, and all eyes at once were turned upon him. He smiled a greeting, and closed the door. But as he advanced, he began to realize that the sudden silence was unnatural and ominous. He came to the foot of the table, where there was a vacant place. He looked at the faces on either side of it, and lastly at Carmagnola seated at its head, between Valeria and John Giacomo. "What do you debate here?" he asked them. Carmagnola answered him. His voice was hard and hostile. His blue eyes avoided the steady glance of Bellarion's. "We were about to send for you. We have discovered the traitor who is communicating with Theodore of Montferrat, forewarning him of our every measure, culminating in last night's business. That is something, although it comes at a time when it can no longer greatly matter." "Who is your traitor?" None answered him for a long moment. Saving Stoffel, who was flushed and smiling disdainfully, and the princess whose eyes were lowered, they continued to stare at him, and he began to mislike their stare. At last, Carmagnola pushed towards him a folded square of parchment bearing a broken seal. "Read that." Bellarion took it, and turned it over. To his surprise he found it superscribed, "To the magnificent Lord Bellarion Cain, Prince of Valsassina." He frowned, and a little color kindled in his cheeks. He threw up his head, stern-eyed. "How?" he asked. "Who breaks the seals of a letter addressed to me?" "Read the letter," said Carmagnola, peremptorily. Bellarion read. "Dear Lord and friend, your fidelity to me and my concerns saved Vercelli last night from a blow that in its consequences might have led to our surrender, for without your forewarning we should assuredly have been taken by surprise. I desire you to know my recognition of my debt, and to assure you again of the highest reward that it lies in my power to bestow if you continue to serve me with the same loyal devotion. Theodore Paleologo of Montferrat." Bellarion looked up from the letter with some anger in his face, but infinitely more contempt and even a shade of amusement. "Where was this thing manufactured?" he asked. Carmagnola's answer was prompt. "In Vercelli, by the Marquis Theodore. It is in his own hand, as Madonna here has testified, and it is sealed with his own seal. Do you wonder that I broke it?" Sheer amazement overspread Bellarion's face. He looked at the princess, who fleetingly looked up to answer the question in his glance. "The hand is my uncle's, sir." He turned the parchment over, and conned the seal with its stag device. Then the amazement passed out of his face, light broke on it, and he uttered a laugh. He turned, pulled up a stool, and sat down at the table's foot, whence he had them all under his eye. "Let us proceed with method. How did this letter reach you, Carmagnola?" Carmagnola waved to Belluno, and Belluno, hostile of tone and manner, answered the question. "A clown coming from the direction of the city blundered into my section of the lines this morning. He begged to be taken to you. My men naturally brought him to me. I questioned him as to what he desired with you. He answered that he bore a message. I asked him what message he could be bearing to you from Vercelli. He refused to answer further, whereupon I threatened him, and he produced this letter. Seeing its seal, I took both the fellow and the letter to my lord Carmagnola. Bellarion, himself, completed the tale. And Carmagnola perceiving that seal took it upon himself to break it, and so discovered the contents to be what already he suspected. That is what occurred. Bellarion, entirely at his ease, looked at them with amused contempt, and finally at Carmagnola in whose face he laughed. God save you, Carmagnola. I often wonder what will be the end of you. I am no longer wondering what will be the end of you, he was furiously answered, which only went to increase his amusement. And you others, you were equally deceived. The letter and Carmagnola's advocacy of my falseness and treachery were not to be resisted. I have not been deceived, Stoffel protested. I was not classing you with those addled heads, Stoffel. It will need more than abuse to clear you, Tendo warned him angrily. You, too, Ugolino. And you, Madonna, and even you Lord Marquis. Well, well. It may need more than abuse to clear me, but surely not more than this letter. Falsehood is in every line of it, in the superscription, in the seal itself. How, sir, the princess asked him. Do you insist that it is forged? I have your word that it is not. But read the letter again. He tossed it to them. The Marquis Theodore pays your wits a poor compliment, Carmagnola, and the sequel has justified him. Ask yourselves this: if I were, indeed, Theodore's friend and ally, could he have taken a better way than this of putting it beyond my power to serve him further? It is plainly superscribed to me, so that there shall be no mistake as to the person for whom it is intended, and it bears his full signature, so that there shall be no possible mistake on the score of whence it comes. In addition to that, he has sealed it with his arms, so that the first person into whose hands it falls shall be justified in ascertaining, as you did, what Theodore of Montferrat may have occasion to write to me. It was expected that the soldiers who caught the clown would bear him straight to you, Carmagnola countered. Was it? Is there no oddness in the fact that the clown should walk straight into your own men, Carmagnola, on a section of the line that does not lie directly between Vercelli and Quinto? But why waste time even on such trifles of evidence? Read the letter itself. Is there a single word in that which it was important to convey to me, or which would not have been conveyed otherwise if it had been intended for any purpose other than to bring me under this suspicion? Almost has Theodore overreached himself in his guile. Out of his intentness to destroy me, he has revealed his true aims. The very arguments I used with them, said Stoffel. Bellarion looked in amazement at his lieutenant. And they failed? He cried, incredulous. Of course they failed, you foul traitor. Carmagnola bawled at him. They are ingenious, but they are obvious to a man caught as you are. It is not I that am caught. But you that are in danger of it, Carmagnola, in danger of being caught in the web that Theodore has spun. To what end? To what end should he spin it? Answer that. Perhaps to set up dissensions amongst us, perhaps to remove the only one of the captains opposed to him whom he respects. You're modest, by God, sneered Carmagnola. And you're a purblind fool, Carmagnola, cried Stoffel in heat. Then are we all fools, said Belluno. For we are all of the same mind on this. Aye, said Bellarion sadly. You're all of the same emptiness. That's clear. Well, let us have in this clown and question him. To what purpose? That we may wring from him his precise instructions, since the letter does not suffice. You take too much for granted. The letter suffices fully. You forget that it is not all the evidence against you. What? Is there more? There is your failure last night to make the false attack you undertook to make, and there is the intention you so rashly proclaimed here afterwards that you would raise the siege of Vercelli today. Why should you wish to do that if you are not Theodore's friend, if you are not the canker-hearted traitor we now know you to be? If I were to tell you, you would not understand. I should merely give you another proof that I am Theodore's ally. That is very probable, said Carmagnola with a heavy sneer. Fetch the guard, Ercole. What's this? Bellarion was on his feet even as Belluno rose, and Stoffel came up with him, laying hands on his weapons. But Ugolino de Tenda and another captain between them overpowered him, whilst the other two ranged themselves swiftly on Bellarion's either hand. Bellarion looked at them, and from them again to Carmagnola. He was lost in amazement. Are you daring to place me under arrest? Until we deliberate what shall be done with you. We shall not keep you waiting long. My God! His wits worked swiftly, and he saw clearly that they might easily work their will with him. Of the 4,000 men out there, only Stoffel's 800 Switzers would be on his side. The others would follow the lead of their respective captains. The leaders upon whom he could have depended in this pass, Königshofen and Giasone Trotta, were away at Mortera. Perceiving at last this danger, hitherto entirely unsuspected, he turned now to the princess. Madonna, he said, it is you whom I serve. Once before you suspected me, in the matter of Carmagnola's bridges, and the sequel proved you wrong. Slowly she raised her eyes to look at him fully for the first time since he had joined that board. They were very sorrowful and her pallor was deathly. There are other matters, sir, besides that, which I remember. There is the death of Enzo Spigno, for one. He recoiled as if she had struck him. Spigno. He echoed, and uttered a queer little laugh. So it is Spigno who rises from his grave for vengeance. Not for vengeance, sir. For justice. There would be that if there were not the matter that Messer Carmagnola has urged to convict you. To convict me. Am I then convicted without trial? None answered him, and in the pause that followed the men-at-arms summoned by Belluno clanked in, and at a sign from Carmagnola closed about Bellarion. There were 4 of them. One of the captains deprived him of his dagger, the only weapon upon him, and flung it on the table. At last Bellarion roused himself to some show of real heat. "Oh, but this is madness. What do you intend by me?" "That is to be deliberated. But be under no delusive hope, Bellarion. You are to decide my fate. You." From Carmagnola, he looked at the others. He had paled a little, but amazement still rode above fear. Stoffel, unable longer to contain himself, turned furiously upon Carmagnola. "You rash, vainglorious fool. If Bellarion is to be tried, there is none under the Duke's magnificence before whom he may be arraigned. He has been arraigned already before us here. His guilt is clear, and he has said nothing to dispel a single hair of it. There remains only to decide his sentence. This is no proper arraignment. There has been no trial, nor have you power to hold one," Stoffel insisted. "You are wrong, Captain. There are military laws. I say this is no trial. If Bellarion is to be tried, you'll send him before the Duke. And at the same time, put in Bellarion, you'll send your single witness, this clown who brought that letter. Your refusal to produce him here before me now in itself shows the malice by which you're moved." Carmagnola flushed under that charge, and scowlingly considered the prisoner. "If the form of trial you've received does not content you, and since you charge me with personal feeling, there is another I am ready to afford." He drew himself up, and flung back his handsome head. "Trial by battle, Lord Prince." Over Bellarion's white face a sneer was spread. "And what shall it prove if you ride me down? Shall it prove more than that you have the heavier weight of brawn, that you are more practiced in the lists and have the stronger thews? Does it need trial by battle to prove that?" "God will defend the right," said Carmagnola. "Will he so?" Bellarion laughed. "I am glad to have your word for it. But you forget that the right to challenge lies with me, the accused. In your blundering stupidity you overlook essentials always. Your very dullness acquits you of hypocrisy. Shall I exercise that right upon the person in whose service I am carrying arms, upon the body of the Marquis John Giacomo of Montferrat?" The frail boy named started, and looked up with dilating eyes. His sister cried out in very real alarm. But Carmagnola covered them with his answer. "I am your accuser, sir, not he." "You are his deputy, no more," Bellarion answered, and now the boy came to his feet, white and tense. "He is in the right," he announced. "I cannot refuse him." Smiling, Bellarion looked at Carmagnola, confused and awkward. "Always you overreach yourself," he mocked him. He turned to John Giacomo. "You could not refuse me if I asked it. But I do not ask it. I only desire to show the value of Carmagnola's offer." "You have some decency still," Carmagnola told him. "Whilst you cannot lay claim even to that. God made you a fool, and that's the end of the matter. Take him away." Already it seemed they had their orders. They laid hands upon him, and, submitting without further words, he suffered them to lead him out. As the door closed upon him, Stoffel exploded. He raged and stormed. He pleaded, argued, and vituperated them, even the princess herself, for fools and dolts, and finally threatened to raise the army against them, or at least to do his utmost with his Swiss to prevent them from carrying out their evil intentions. "Listen!" Carmagnola commanded sternly, and in the silence they heard from the hall below a storm of angry outcries. "That is the voice of the army, answering you, the voice of those who were maimed last night as a result of his betrayal. Saving yourself, there is not a captain in the army, and saving your own Swiss, hardly a man who is not this morning clamoring for Bellarion's death. You are confessing that you published the matter even before Bellarion was examined here. My God, you villain, you Helkite, you swaggering ape, who give a free rein to the base jealousy in which you have ever held Bellarion. Your mean spite may drive you now to the lengths of murder. But look to yourself thereafter. You'll lose your empty head over this, Carmagnola. They silenced him and bore him out, whereafter they sat down to seal Bellarion's fate. 11. The pledge. Unanimously the captains voted for Bellarion's death. The only dissensions were the Marquis and his sister. The latter was appalled by the swiftness with which this thing had come upon them, and shrank from being in any sense a party to the slaying of a man, however guilty. Also not only was she touched by Bellarion's forbearance in the matter of trial by battle against her brother, but his conduct in that connection sowed in her mind the first real doubt of his guilt. Urgently she pleaded that he should be sent for trial before the Duke. Carmagnola, in refusing, conveyed the impression of a great soul wrestling with circumstances, a noble knight placing duty above inclination. It was a part that well became his splendid person. Because you ask it, Madonna, for one reason, because of the imputations of malice against me for another, I would give years of my life to wash my hands of him and send him to Duke Filippo Maria. But out of other considerations, in which your own and your brother's future are concerned, I dare not. Saving perhaps Stoffel and his Swiss, the whole army demands his death. The matter has gone too far. The captains one and all proved him right by their own present insistence. Yet I do not believe him guilty, the young Marquis startled them, and I will be no party to the death of an innocent man. Would any of us? Carmagnola asked him. Is there any room for doubt? The letter. The letter, the boy interrupted hotly, is, as Bellarion says, a trick of my uncle's to remove the one enemy he fears. That touched Carmagnola's vanity with wounding effect. He dissembled the hurt. But it served to strengthen his purpose. That vain boaster has seduced you with his argument, eh? No, not with his argument, but with his conduct. He could have challenged me to trial by combat, as he showed. What am I to stand against him? A thing of straw. Yet he declined. Was that the action of a trickster? It was, Carmagnola answered emphatically. It was a trick to win you over. For he knew, as we all know, that a sovereign prince does not lie under that law of chivalry. He knew that if he had demanded it, you would have been within your right in appointing a deputy. Why, then, did you not say so at the time? The princess asked him. Because he did not press the matter. Oh, Madonna, believe me, there is no man in Italy who less desires to have Bellarion's blood on his hands than I. He spoke sorrowfully, heavily. But my duty is clear, and whether it were clear or not, I must be governed by the voice of these captains, all of whom demand, and rightly, this double-dealing traitor's death. Emphatically the captains confirmed him in the assertion, as emphatically John Giacomo repeated that he would be no party to it. You are not required to be, Carmagnola assured him. You may stand aside, my lord, and allow justice to take its course. Sirs, the princess appealed to them, let me implore you again, at least to send him to the duke. Let the responsibility of his death lie with his master. Carmagnola rose. Madonna, what you ask would lead to a mutiny. Tomorrow either I send Bellarion's head to his ally in Vercelli, or the men will be out of hand and there will be an end to this campaign. Dismiss your doubts and your fears. His guilt is crystal clear. You need but remember his avowed intention of raising the siege, to see in whose interest he works. Heavy-eyed and heavy-hearted she sat, tormented by doubt now that she was face to face with decision where hitherto no single doubt had been. You never asked him what alternative he proposed, she reminded him. To what end? That glib dissembler would have fooled us with fresh falsehoods. Belluno got to his feet. He had been manifesting impatience for some moments. Have we leave to go, my lord? This matter is at an end. Ugolino da Tenda followed his example. The men below are growing noisier. It is time we pacified them with our decision. In God's name. Carmagnola waved them away, and himself strode off from the table towards the hearth. He stirred the logs with his boot and sent an explosion of sparks flying up the chimney. Bear him word of our decision, Belluno. Bid him prepare for death. He shall have until daybreak tomorrow to make his soul. O God! If we should be wrong! Groaned the princess. The captains clanked out, and the door closed. Slowly Carmagnola turned, reproachfully he regarded her. Have you no faith in me, Valeria? Should I do this thing if there were any room for doubt? You may be mistaken. You have been mistaken before, remember. He did not like to remember it. And you? Have you been mistaken all these years? Are you mistaken on the death of your friend Count Spigno and what followed? Ah! I was forgetting that, she confessed. Remember it. And remember what he said at that table, which may, after all, be the truth. That Count Spigno has risen from the grave at last for vengeance. Will you not send for this clown, at least, cried John Giacomo. To what purpose now? What can he add to what we know? The matter, Lord Marquis, is finished. And meanwhile Belluno was seeking Bellarion in the small chamber in which they had confined him on the ground floor of the castle. With perfect composure Bellarion heard the words of doom. He did not believe them. This sudden thing was too monstrously impossible. It was incredible the gods should have raised him so swiftly to his pinnacle of fame, merely to cast him down again for their amusement. They might make sport with him, but they would hardly carry it to the lengths of quenching his life. His only answer now was to proffer his pinioned wrists, and beg that the cord might be cut. Belluno shook his head to that in silence. Bellarion grew indignant. What purpose does it serve beyond a cruelty? The window is barred. The door is strong, and there is probably a guard beyond it. I could not escape if I would. You'll be less likely to attempt it with bound wrists. I'll pass you my parole of honor to remain a prisoner. You are convicted of treachery, and you know as well as I do that the parole of a convicted traitor is never taken. Go to the devil, then, said Bellarion, which so angered Belluno that he called in the guard, and ordered them to bind Bellarion's ankles as well. So trust that he could move only by hops, and then at the risk of falling, they left him. He sat down on one of the two stools which with a table made up all the furniture of that bare chill place. He wagged his head and even smiled over the thought of Belluno's refusal to accept his parole, or rather over the thought that in offering it he had no notion of keeping it. I'd break more than my pledged word to get out of this, said he to himself. And only an idiot would blame me. He looked round the bare stone walls, and lastly at the window. He rose, and hopped over to it. Leaning on the sill, which was at the height of his breast, he looked out. It opened upon the inner court, he found, so that wherever escape might lie, it lay not that way. The sill upon the rough edge of which he leaned was of granite. He studied it a while attentively. The fools, he said, and hopped back to his stool, where he gave himself up to quiet meditation until they brought him a hunch of bread and a jug of wine. To the man-at-arms who acted as jailer, he held out his pinioned wrists. How am I to eat and drink, he asked. You'll make shift as best you can. He made shift, and by using his two hands as one contrived to eat and to drink. After that he spent some time at the sill, patiently drawing his wrists backwards and forwards along the edge of it, with long rests between whiles to restore the blood which had flowed out of upheld arms. It was wearying toil, and kept him fully engaged for some hours. Towards dusk he set up a shouting which at last brought the guard into his prison. You're in haste to die, my lord, the fellow insolently mocked him. But quiet you. The stranglers are bidden for daybreak. And I am to perish like a dog? Bellarion furiously asked him. With pinioned wrists and ankles he sat there by his table. Am I never to have a priest to shrive me? Oh! Ah! A priest? The fellow went out. He went in quest of Carmagnola. But Carmagnola was absent, marshalling his men against a threatened attempt by Stoffel and the Swiss to rescue Bellarion. The captains were away about the same business, and there remained only the princess and her brother. Messer Bellarion is asking for a priest, he told them. Has none been sent to him? Cried John Giacomo, scandalized. He'd not be sent until an hour before the stranglers. Valeria shuddered, and sat numbed with horror. John Giacomo swore under his breath. In God's name, let the poor fellow have a priest at once. Let one be sent for from Quinto. It would be an hour later when a preaching friar from the convent of St. Dominic was ushered into Bellarion's prison, a tall, frail man in a long black mantle over his white habit. The guard placed a lantern on the table, glanced compassionately at the prisoner, who sat there as he had earlier seen him with pinioned wrists and ankles. But something had happened to the cords meanwhile, for no sooner had the guard passed out and closed the door than Bellarion stood up and his bonds fell from him like cobwebs, startling the good monk who came to shrive him. Infinitely more startled was the good monk to find himself suddenly seized by the throat in a pair of strong, nervous hands whose thumbs were so pressed into his windpipe that he could neither cry out nor breathe. He writhed in that unrelenting grip, until a fierce whisper quieted him. Be still if you would hope to live. If you undertake to make no sound, tap your foot twice upon the ground, and I'll release you. Frantically the foot was tapped. But remember that at the first outcry, I shall kill you without mercy. He removed his hands, and the priest almost choked himself in his sudden greed of air. Why? Why do you assault me? He gasped. I come to comfort and... I know why you come better than you do, brother. You think you bring me the promise of eternal life. All that I require from you at present is the promise of temporal existence. So we'll leave the shriving for something more urgent. It would be a half-hour later, when cowled as he had entered the hall, the bowed figure of the priest emerged again from the room, bearing the lantern. I've brought the light, my son, he said almost in a whisper. Your prisoner desires to be alone in the dark with his thoughts. The man-at-arms took the lantern in one hand, whilst with the other he was driving home the bolt. Suddenly he swung the lantern to the level of the cowl. This priest did not seem quite the same as the one who had entered. The next moment, on his back, his throat gripped by the vigorous man who knelt upon him, the guard knew that his suspicions had been well founded. Another moment and he knew nothing. For the hands that held him had hammered his head against the stone floor until consciousness was blotted out. Bellarion extinguished the lantern, pushed the unconscious man-at-arms into the deepest shadow of that dimly lighted hall, adjusted his mantle and cowl, and went quickly out. The soldiers in the courtyard saw in that cowled figure only the monk who had gone to shrive Bellarion. The postern was opened for him, and with a murmured Pax Vobiscum, he passed out across the lesser bridge, and gained the open. Thereafter, under cover of the night, he went at speed, the monkish gown tucked high, for he knew not how soon the sentinel he had stunned might recover to give the alarm. In his haste he almost stumbled upon a strong picket, and in fleeing from that he was within an ace of blundering into another. Thereafter he proceeded with more caution over ground that was everywhere held by groups of soldiers, posted by Carmagnola against any attempt on the part of the Swiss. As a result it was not until an hour or so before midnight that he came at last to Stoffel's quarters, away to the south of Vercelli, and found there everything in ferment. He was stopped by a party of men of Uri, to whom at once he made himself known, and even whilst they conducted him to their captain, the news of his presence ran like fire through the Swiss encampment. Stoffel, who was in full armor when Bellarion entered his tent, gasped his questioning amazement whilst Bellarion threw off his mantle and white woolen habit, and stood forth in his own proper person and garments. We were on the point of coming for you, Stoffel told him. A fool's errand, Werner. What could you have done against 3,000 men, who are ready and expecting you? But he spoke with a warm hand firmly gripping Stoffel's shoulders and a heart warmed, indeed, by this proof of trust and loyalty. Something we might have done. There was a will on our side that must be lacking on the other. And the walls of Quinto? You'd have beaten your heads in vain against them, even had you succeeded in reaching them. It's as lucky for you as for me that I've saved you this trouble. And what now? Stoffel asked him. Give the order to break camp at once. We march to Montferrat to rejoin the company of the White Dog from which I should never have separated. We'll show Carmagnola and those Montferrine princes what Bellarion can do. Meanwhile they already had some notion of it. The alarm at his escape had spread through Quinto, and Carmagnola had been fetched from the lines to be informed of it in detail by a half-naked priest and a man-at-arms with a bandaged head. It had taken some time to find him. It took more for him to resolve what should be done. At last, however, he decided that Bellarion would have fled to Stoffel, so he assembled his captains, and with the whole army marched on the Swiss encampment. But he came too late. At the last the Swiss had not waited to strike their camp, realizing the danger of delay, but had departed leaving it standing. Back to Quinto and the agitated princess went Carmagnola with the news of failure. He found her waiting alone in the armory, huddled in a great chair by the fire. That he will have gone to his own condotta at Montferrat is certain, he declared. But without knowing which road he took, how could I follow in the dark? And to follow meant fulfilling that traitor's intention of raising this siege. He raged and swore, striding to and fro there in his wrath, bitterly upbraiding himself for not having taken better precautions, knowing with what a trickster he had to deal. Damning the priest and the sentry and the fools in the courtyard who had allowed Bellarion to walk undetected through their ranks. She watched him, and found him less admirable than hitherto in the wildness of his ravings. Unwillingly almost her mind contrasted his behavior under stress with the calm she had observed in Bellarion. She fetched a weary sigh. If only Bellarion had been true and loyal, what a champion would he not have been? Raging will not help you, Carmagnola, she said at last, the least asperity in her tone. It brought him, pained, to a halt before her. And whence, Madonna, is my rage? Have I lost anything? Do I strive here for personal ends? Ha! I rage at the thought of the difficulties that will rise up for you. For me. Can you doubt what will follow? Do you think that all that we have lost tonight is Bellarion, with perhaps his Swiss? The men at Montferrat are mostly of his own company, the company of the dog. A well-named company, as God lives. And those who are not serve under captains who are loyal to him and who, knowing nothing of his discovered treachery here, will be beguiled by that seducer. In strength he will be our superior, with close upon 4,000 men. She looked up at him in alarm. You are suggesting that we shall have him coming against us. What else? Do we not know enough already of his aims? By all the saints! Things could not have fallen out better to give him the pretext that he needed. He was raging again. Had this sly devil contrived these circumstances himself, he could not have improved them. By these he can justify himself at need to the Duke. Oh, he's turned the tables on us. Now you see why I meant to give him no chance. She kept her mind to the essence of the matter. Then if he comes against us, we are lost. We shall be caught between his army and my uncle's. His overweening vanity would not permit him to admit, or even to think, so much. He laughed, confident and disdainful. Have you so little faith in me, Valeria? I am no apprentice in this art of war. And with the thought of you to spur me on, do you think that I will suffer defeat? I'll not lay down my arms while I have life to serve you. I will take measures tomorrow. And I will send letters to the Duke, informing him of Bellarion's defection and begging reinforcements. Can you doubt that they will come? Is Filippo Maria the man to let one of his captains mutiny and go unpunished? He laughed again, full of a confidence by which she was infected. And he looked so strong and masterful, so handsome in the half-armor he still wore, a very god of war. She held out a hand to him. My friend, forgive my doubt. You shall be dishonored by no more fears of mine. He caught her hand. He drew her out of the chair, and towards him until she brought up against his broad mailed breast. That is the fine brave spirit that I love in you as I love all in you, Valeria. You are mine, Valeria. God made us for each other. Not yet, she said, smiling a little, her eyes downcast and veiled from his ardent glance. When then? Was his burning question. When Theodore has been whipped out of Montferrat. His arms tightened about her until his armor hurt her. It is a pledge, Valeria. A pledge, she echoed on a questioning, exalted note. The man who does that may claim me when he wants me. I swear it. 12. Carmagnola's duty. My lord of Carmagnola had shut himself up in a small room on the ground floor of the castle of Quinto to indite a letter to the high and most potent Duke Filippo Maria of Milan. A heavy labor this of quill on parchment for one who had little scholarship. It was a labor that fell to him so rarely that he had never perceived until now the need to equip himself with a secretary. The princess and her brother newly returned from mass on that Sunday morning, for days after Bellarion's escape, were together in the armory discussing their situation, and differing a good deal in their views. For the mental eyes of the young Marquis were not dazzled by the effulgence of Carmagnola's male beauty, or deceived by his histrionic attitudes. Into their presence, almost unheralded, were ushered two men. One of these was small and slight and active as a monkey, the other a fellow of great girth with a big, red, boldly humorous face, blue eyes under black brows flanking a beak of a nose, and a sparse fringe of grey hair straggling about a gleaming bald head. The sight of those two, who smirked and bowed, brought brother and sister very suddenly to their feet. Barbaresco, she cried on a note of gladness, holding out both her hands. And Casale. And, said Barbaresco, as he rolled forward, near upon another 500 refugees from Montferrat, both Guelph and Ghibelline, whom we've been collecting in Piedmont and Lombardy to swell the army of the great Bellarion and settle accounts with Master Theodore. They kissed her hands, and then her brother's. My lord Marquis, cried the fire-eating Casale, his gimlet glance appraising the lad. You're so well grown I should hardly have known you. We are your servants, my lord, as Madonna here can tell you. For years have we labored for you and suffered for you. But we touch the end of all that now, as do you. Theodore is brought to bay at last. We are hounds to help you pull him down. At no season could their coming have been more welcome or uplifting than in this hour of dark depression, when recruits to the cause of the young Marquis were so urgently required. This she told them, announcing their arrival a good omen. Servants were summoned, and dispatched for wine, and whilst the newcomers drank the hot spiced beverage provided they learnt the true meaning of her words. It sobered their exultation. This defection of Bellarion and his powerful company amounting to more than half of the entire army altered their outlook completely. Barbaresco blew out his great cheeks, frowning darkly. You say that Bellarion is the agent of Theodore? He cried. We have proof of it, she sadly assured him, and told him of the letter. His amazement deepened. Does it surprise you, then? She asked. Surely it should be no news to you. Once it would not have been. For once I thought that I held proof of the same, that was on the night that Spigno died at his hands. Later, before that same night was out, I understood better why he killed Spigno. You understood? Why he killed him? She was white to the lips. John Giacomo was leaning forward across the table, his face eager. She uttered a fretful laugh. He killed him because he was my friend, mine and my brother's, the chief of all our friends. Barbaresco shook his great head. He killed him because this Spigno whom we all trusted so completely was a spy of Theodore's. What? Her world reeled about her, her senses battled in a mist. The thick, droning voice of Barbaresco came to deepen her confusion. It is all so simple, so very clear. The facts that Spigno was dressed as we found him and in the attic where we had imprisoned Bellarion should in themselves have explained everything. How came he there? Bellarion was all but convicted of being an agent of Theodore's. But for Spigno we should have dealt with him out of hand. Then at dead of night Spigno went to liberate him, and by that very act convicted himself in Bellarion's eyes. And for that Bellarion stabbed him. The only flaw is how one agent of Theodore's should have come to be under such a misapprehension about the other. Saving that the thing would have been clear at once. That I can explain, said Valeria breathlessly, if you have sound proof of Spigno's guilt, if it is not all based on rash assumption. Assumption, laughed Casale, and he took up the tale. That night, when we determined upon flight, we first repaired, because of our suspicions, to Spigno's lodging. We found there a letter addressed superscribed to Theodore, to be delivered in the event of Spigno's death or disappearance. Within it we found a list of our names and of the part which each of us had had in the plot to kill the regent. And the terms of that letter made it more than clear that throughout Spigno had been Theodore's agent for the destruction of the Marquis here. That letter, said Barbaresco, was a safeguard the scoundrel had prepared in the event of discovery. The threat of its dispatch to Theodore would have been used to compel us to hold our hands. Oh, a subtle villain, your best and most loyal friend Count Spigno, and but for Bellarion, he spread his hands and laughed. Then Casale interposed. You said, Madonna, that you could supply the link that's missing in our chain. But she was not listening. She sat with drooping head, her hands listlessly folded in her lap. It was all true. All true. Her tone seemed the utterance of a broken heart. And I have mistrusted him, and... Oh, God, she cried out. When I think that by now he might have been strangled and with my consent. And now, cut in her brother almost brutally considering the pain she was already bearing, you and that swaggering fool Carmagnola have between you driven him out and perhaps set him against us. The swaggering fool came in at that moment with inky fingers and disordered hair. The phrase that greeted him brought him to a halt on the threshold, his attitude magnificent. What's this? He asked with immense dignity. He was told, by John Giacomo, so fiercely and unsparingly that he went red and white by turns as he listened. Then, commanding himself and wrapped in his dignity as in a mantle, he came slowly forward. He even smiled, condescendingly. Of all this that you tell I know nothing. It may well be as you say. It is no concern of mine. What concerns me is what has happened here. The discovery that Bellarion was in correspondence with Theodore, and his avowed intention to raise this siege. Add to this that he has slipped through our hands, and is now abroad to work your ruin, and consider if you are justified in using hard words to me but for whom your ruin would already have been encompassed. His majestic air and his display of magnanimity under their reproach imposed upon all but Valeria. It was she who answered him. You are forgetting that it was only my conviction that he had been Theodore's agent aforetime which disposed me to believe him Theodore's agent now. But the letter, then? Carmagnola was showing signs of exasperation. In God's name, where is this letter? Growled the deep voice of Barbaresco. Who are you to question me now? I do not know your right, sir, or even your name. The princess presented him and at the same time Casale. They are old and esteemed friends, my lord, and they are here to serve me with all the men that they can muster. Let Messer Barbaresco see this letter. Impatiently Carmagnola produced it from the script that hung beside his dagger from a gold-embossed girdle of crimson leather. Slowly Barbaresco spelled it out, Casale reading over his shoulder. When he had done, he looked at Carmagnola, and from Carmagnola to the others, first in sheer amazement, then in scornful mirth. Lord of Heaven, Messer Carmagnola. You've the repute of a great fighter, and, to be sure, you're a fine figure of a man, also I must assume you honest. But I would sooner put my trust in your animal strength than in your wits. Sir. Oh, to be sure, you can throw out your chest and roar and strut. But use your brains for once, man. The boldly humorous red face was overspread by a sardonic grin. Master Theodore took your measure shrewdly when he thought to impose upon you with this foxy piece of buffoonery, and, my faith, if Bellarion had been less nimble, this trick would have served its purpose. Nay, now don't puff and blow and swell. Read the letter again. Ask yourself if it would have borne that full signature and that superscription if it had been sincere, and considering that it imparts no useful information save that Bellarion was betraying you. Ask yourself if it would have been written at all had anything it says been true. The very arguments that Bellarion used, cried the Marquis. To which we would not listen, said the princess bitterly. Carmagnola sniffed. They are the arguments any man in his case would use. You overlook that the letter is an incentive, an undertaking to reward him suitably if he. Barbaresco broke in, exasperated by the man's grandiose stupidity. To the devil with that, numbskull. Numbskull, sir. To me? By heaven. Sirs, sirs. The princess laid her hand on Barbaresco's great arm. This is not seemly to my lord Carmagnola. I know it. I know it. I crave his pardon. But I was never taught to suffer fools gladly. Sir, your every word is an offense. You. Valeria calmed them. Don't you see, Messer Carmagnola, that he but uses you as a whipping boy instead of me? It is I who am the fool, the numbskull in his eyes. For these deeds are more mine than any others. But my old friend Barbaresco is too courteous to say so. Courteous, snorted Carmagnola. That is the last term I should apply to his boorishness. By what right does he come hectoring here? By the right of his old affection for me and my brother. That is what makes him hot. For my sake, then, bear with him, sir. The great man bowed, his hand upon his heart, signifying that for her sake there was no indignity he would not suffer. Thereafter he defended himself with great dignity. If the letter had been all, he might have taken Barbaresco's views. But it was, he repeated, the traitor Bellarion's avowed intention to raise the siege. That, in itself, was a proof of his double dealing. How did this letter come to you? Barbaresco asked. John Giacomo answered whilst Valeria added in bitter self-reproach, and this messenger was never examined, although Bellarion demanded that he should be brought before us. Do you upbraid me with that, Madonna? Carmagnola cried. He was a poor clown, who could have told us nothing. He was not examined because it would have been waste of time. Let us waste it now, said Barbaresco. To what purpose, sir? Why, to beguile our leisure. No other entertainment offers. Carmagnola contained himself under that sardonic leer. Sir, you are resolved, it seems, to try my patience. It requires all my regard and devotion for her highness to teach me to endure it. The messenger shall be brought. At Valeria's request not only the messenger, but the captains who had voted Bellarion's death were also summoned. Carmagnola demurred at first, but bowed in the end to her stern insistence. They came, and when they were all assembled, they were told by the princess why they had been summoned as well as what she had that morning learnt from Barbaresco. Then the messenger was brought in between the guards, and it was the princess herself who questioned him. You have nothing to fear, boy, she assured him gently, as he cowered in terror before her. You are required to answer truthfully. When you have done so, and unless I discover that you are lying, you shall be restored to liberty. Carmagnola, who had come to take his stand at her side, bent over her. Is that prudent, Madonna? Prudent or not, it is promised. There was in her tone an asperity that dismayed him. She addressed herself to the clown. When you were given this letter you would be given precise instructions for its delivery, were you not? Yes, magnificent Madonna. What were those instructions? I was taken to the ramparts by a knight, to join some other knights and soldiers. They pointed to the line straight ahead. I was to go in that direction with the letter. If taken I was to ask for the Lord Bellarion. Were you bidden to go cautiously? To conceal yourself? No, Madonna. On the contrary. My orders were to let myself be seen. I am answering truthfully, Madonna. When you were told to go straight ahead into the lines that were pointed out to you, on which side of the ramparts were you standing? On the south side, Madonna. By the southern gate. That is truth, as God hears me. The princess leaned forward, and she was not the only one to move. Were you told or did you know what soldiers occupied the section of the lines to which you were bidden? I just knew that they were soldiers of the besieging army, or the Lord Bellarion's army. I am telling you the truth, Madonna. I was told to be careful to go straight, and not to wander into any other part of the line but that. Ugolino de Tenda made a sharp forward movement. What are you saying? The truth. The truth, cried the lad in terror. May God strike me dumb forever if I have uttered a lie. Quiet. Quiet, the princess admonished him. Be sure we know when you speak the truth. Keep to it and fear nothing. Did you hear mention of any name in connection with that section of the line? Did I? He searched his mind, and his eyes brightened. I did. They spoke amongst them. They named one Carmagnola, or Carmagnola. Or Carmagnola, the Tenda cut in, and laughed splutteringly in sheer contempt. It's clear, I think, that Theodore's letter was intended for just the purpose that it served. Clear. How is it clear? Carmagnola's contempt was in the question. In everything, now that we have heard this clown. Why was he sent to the southern section? Do you suppose Theodore did not know that Valsassina himself and those directly under him, of whom I was one, were quartered in Quinto, on the western side? Then his voice swelled up in anger. Why was this messenger not examined sooner, or, he checked and his eyes narrowed as they fixed themselves on Carmagnola's flushed and angry face, or, was he? Was he? Roared Carmagnola. Now what the devil do you mean? You know what I mean, Carmagnola. You led us all within an ace of doing murder. Did you lead us so because you're a fool, or a villain? Which? Carmagnola sprang for him, roaring like a bull. The other captains got between, and the princess on her feet, commanding, imperious, added her voice sharply to theirs to restore order. They obeyed that slim, frail woman, scarcely more than a girl, as she stood there straight and tense in her wine-colored mantle, her red gold head so proudly held, her dark eyes burning in her white face. Captain Ugolino, that was ill said of you, she reproved him. You forget that if this messenger was not examined before, the blame for that is upon all of us. We took too much for granted and too readily against the Prince of Valsassina. It is now that you take too much for granted, answered Carmagnola. Why did Valsassina intend to raise this siege if he is honest? Answer me that. His challenge was to all. Ugolino de Tenda answered it. For some such reason as he had when he sent his men to hold the bridge at Carpignano while you were building bridges here. Bellarion's intentions are not clear to dull eyes like yours and mine, Carmagnola. Carmagnola considered him malevolently. You and I will discuss this matter further elsewhere, he promised him. You have used expressions I am not the man to forget. It may be good for you to remember them, said the young captain, no whit intimidated. Meanwhile, Madonna, I take my leave. I march my condotta out of this camp within an hour. She looked at him in sudden distress. He answered the look. I am grieved, Madonna. But my duty is to the Prince of Valsassina. I was seduced from it by too hasty judgment. I return to it at once. He bowed low, gathered up his cloak, and went clanking out. Hold there. Carmagnola thundered after him. Before you go I've an account to settle with you. Ugolino turned on the threshold, drawn up to his full height. I'll afford you the opportunity, said he, but only after I have the answer to my question, whether you are a villain or a fool, and only if I find that you're a fool. The captains made a barrier which Carmagnola could not pass. Livid with anger and humiliation, his grand manner dissipated, he turned to the princess. Will your highness suffer me to go after him? He must not be permitted to depart. But she shook her red gold head. Nay, sir. I detain no man here against his inclinations. And Captain Ugolino seems justified of his. Justified. Dear God. Justified. He apostrophized the groined ceiling, then swung to the other 4 captains standing there. And you, he demanded. Do you also deem yourselves justified to mutiny? Belluno was prompt to answer. But then Belluno was his own lieutenant. My lord, if there has been an error we are all in it, and have the honesty to admit it. I am glad there is still some honesty among you. And you? His angry eyes swept over the others. One by one they answered as Belluno had done. But they were men of little account, and the defection of the 4 of them would not have reduced the army as did Ugolino's, whose condotta amounted to close upon 1,000 men. We are forgetting this poor clown, said the princess. Carmagnola looked at him as if he would with joy have wrung his neck. You may go, boy, she told him. You are free. See that he leaves unhindered. He went with his guards. The captains, dismissed, went out next. Carmagnola, his spirit badly bruised and battered, looked at the princess, who had sunk back into her chair. However it has been achieved, she said, Theodore's ends could not better have been served. What is left us now? If I might venture to advise, quoth Barbaresco, smooth as oil, I should say that you could not do better than follow Ugolino de Tenda's example. What? Return to your fealty to Bellarion. Return? Carmagnola leaned towards him from his fine height, and his mouth gaped. Return, he repeated. And leave Vercelli? Why not? That would no more than fulfill Bellarion's intention to raise the siege. He will have an alternative. I care nothing for his alternatives, and let us be clear upon this, I owe him no fealty. My fealty was sworn not to him, but to the Duchess Beatrice. And my orders from Duke Filippo Maria are to assist in the reduction of Vercelli. I know where my duty lies. It is possible, said the princess slowly, that Bellarion had some other plan for bringing Theodore to his knees. He stared at her. There was pain in his handsome eyes. His face was momentarily almost convulsed. And there was little more than pain in his voice when he spoke. Oh, Madonna! Into what irreparable error is your generous heart misleading you? How can you have come in a breath to place all your trust in this man whom for years you have known, as many know him, for a scheming villain? Could I do less having discovered the cruelty of my error? Are you sure, can you be sure upon such slight grounds, that you were in error? That you are not in error now? You heard what Belluno said of him on the night my bridges were destroyed, that Bellarion never looks where he aims. That, sir, is what has misled me, to my present shame. Is it not rather what is misleading you now? You heard what Messer Barbaresco had to tell me. I do not need to hear Messer Barbaresco or any other. I know what I can see for myself, what my wits tell me. She looked at him almost slyly, for one normally so wide-eyed, and her answer all considered was a little cruel. Are you still unshaken in your confidence in your wits? Do you still think that you can trust them? That was the death blow to his passion for her, as it was the death blow of the high hopes he is suspected of having centered in her, seeing himself, perhaps, as the husband of the Princess Valeria of Montferrat. Supreme in Montferrine court and camp. It was a sword thrust full into his vanity, which was the vital part of him. He stepped back, white to the very lips, his countenance disordered. Then, commanding himself, he bowed, and steadied his voice to answer. Madonna, I see that you have made your choice. My prayer will be that you may not have occasion to repent it. No doubt the troops accompanying these gentlemen of Montferrat will be your sufficient escort to Mortera, or you may join forces with Ugolino de Tenda's condotta. Although I shall be left with not more than half the men the enterprise demands, with these I must make shift to reduce Vercelli, as my duty is. Thus, Madonna, you may yet owe your deliverance to me. May God be with you. He bowed again. Perhaps he hoped still for some word to arrest him, some retraction of the injustice with which she used him. But it did not come. I thank you for your good intentions, my lord, she said civilly. God be with you, too. He bit his lip, then turned, and threw high that handsome golden head which he was destined to leave, some few years later, between the pillars of the Piazzetta in Venice. Thus he stalked out. All considered, it was an orderly retreat. And that was the last she ever saw of him. As the door banged, Barbaresco smacked his great thigh with his open palm and exploded into laughter. 13. The occupation of Casale. When Bellarion proclaimed his intention of raising the siege of Vercelli, he had it in mind, in view of the hopelessness of being able to reduce the place reasonably soon, to draw Theodore into the open by means of that strategic movement which Thucydides had taught him, and to which he had so often already and so successfully had recourse. His Swiss, being without baggage, travelled lightly and swiftly. They left their camp before Vercelli on the night of Wednesday, and on the evening of the following Friday, Bellarion brought them into the village of Pavone, where Königshofen had established himself in Ficino's old quarters of 3 years ago. There they lay for the night. But whilst his weary followers rested, himself he spent the greater part of the night in the necessary dispositions for striking camp at dawn. And very early on that misty November morning he was off again with Giasone Trotta, Königshofen, and all the horse, leaving Stoffel to follow more at leisure with the foot, the baggage, and the artillery. Before nightfall he was at San Salvatore, where his army rested, and on the following Sunday morning at just about the time that Barbaresco was reaching Vercelli, Bellarion, Prince of Valsassina, was approaching the Lombard gate into Casale. By the road along which he had fled thence years before, a nameless outcast waif whose only ambition was the study of Greek at Pavia. He had travelled by many roads since then, and after long delays he had reached Pavia, no longer as a poor nameless scholar, but as a condottiero of renown, not to solicit at the university the alms of a little learning, but to command whatever he might crave of the place, holding even its prince in subjection. Greek he had not learnt, but he had learnt much else instead, though nothing that made him love his fellow man or hold the world in high regard. Therefore, he was glad to think that here he touched the end of that long journey begun 5 years ago along this Lombard road. The mission upon which he had set out blindly that day was, after many odd turns of fortune, all but accomplished. When it was done, he would strip off this soldier's harness, abdicate his princely honours, and return on foot, humbler than when he had set out, and cured of his erstwhile heresy, to the benign and peaceful shelter of the convent at Sigliano. There was no attempt to bar his entrance into the Montferrine capital. The officer commanding the place knew himself without the necessary means to oppose this force which so unexpectedly came to demand admittance. And so, the people of Casale, issuing from Mass on that Sunday morning, found the great square before Liutprand's cathedral and the main streets leading from it blocked by outlandish men-at-arms, Italians, Gascons, Burgundians, Swabians, Saxons, and Swiss, whose leader proclaimed himself Captain General of the army of the Marquis John Giacomo of Montferrat. It was a proclamation that not at all reassured them of their dread at the presence of a rapacious and violent soldiery. The Council of Ancients, summoned by Bellarion's heralds, assembled in the communal palace, to hear the terms of this brigand captain, as they conceived him, who had swooped upon their defenceless city. He came attended by a group of officers. He was tall and soldierly of bearing, in full armour, save for his helm, which was borne after him by a page, and his escort, from the brawny, bearded Königshofen to the fierce-eyed, Ferrety Giasone, was calculated to inspire dread in peaceful citizens. But his manner was gentle, and his words were fair. Sirs, your city of Casale has nothing to fear from this occupation, for it is not upon its citizens that we make war, and so that they give no provocation, they will find my followers orderly. We invite your alliance with ourselves in the cause of right and justice. But if you withhold this alliance we shall not visit it against you, provided that you do not go the length of actively opposing us. The high and mighty Lord Filippo Maria Visconti, Duke of Milan, weary of the encroachments upon his dominions resulting from the turbulent ambition of your Prince Regent, the Marquis Theodore, has resolved to make an end of a regency which in itself has already become an usurpation, and to place in the authority to which his majority entitles him your rightful prince, the Marquis John Giacomo Paleologo. I invite you, sirs, to perform your duty as representatives of the people by swearing upon my hands fealty to that same Marquis John Giacomo in the cathedral at the hour of vespers this evening. That invitation was a command, and it was punctually obeyed by men who had not the strength to resist. Meanwhile a measure of reassurance had been afforded the city by Bellarion's proclamation enjoining order upon his troops. The proclamation was in no equivocal terms. It reminded the men that they were in occupation of a friendly city which they were sent to guard and defend, and that any act of pillage or violence would be punished by death. They were housed, some in the citadel, and the remainder in the fortress palace of the Montferrine princes, where Bellarion himself took up his quarters. In Theodore's own closet, occupying the very chair in which Theodore had sat and so contemptuously received the unknown Bellarion on that day when the young student had first entered those august walls. Bellarion that night penned a letter to the Princess Valeria, wherein he gave her news of the day's events. That letter, of a calligraphy so perfect that it might be mistaken for a page from some monkish manuscript of those days, is one of the few fragments that have survived from the hand of this remarkable man who was adventurer, statesman, soldier, and humanist. Most honored and most dear lady, he addresses her, Reveritissima et Carissima Madonna. The exordium is all that need concern us now. Ever since at your own invitation I entered your service that evening in your garden here at Casale, where today I have again wandered reviving memories that are of the fairest in my life, that service has been my constant study. I have pursued it, by tortuous ways and by many actions appearing to have no bearing upon it, unsuspected by you and not actually mistrusted by you. That your mistrust has wounded me oftentimes and deeply, would have weighed lightly with me had I not perceived that by mistrusting you were deprived of that consolation and hope which you would have found in trusting. The facts afforded ever a justification of your mistrust. This I recognized, and that facts are stubborn things, not easily destroyed by words. Therefore I did not vainly wear myself in any endeavor to destroy them, but toiled on, so that, in the ultimate achievement of your selfless aims for your brother, the Marquis, I might prove to you without the need of words the true impulse of my every action in these past 5 years. The fame that came to me as a condottiero, the honors I won, and the increase of power they brought me I have never regarded as anything but weapons to be employed in this your service, as means to the achievement of your ends. But for that service accepted in this garden, my life would have been vastly different from all that it has been. No burden heavier than a scholar's would have been mine, and today I might well be back with the brethren at Sigliano, an obscure member of their great brotherhood. To serve you, I have employed trickery and double-dealing until men have dubbed me a rogue, and some besides yourself have come to mistrust me, and once I went the length of doing murder. But I take no shame in any of these things, nor, most dear lady, need you take shame in that your service should have entailed them. The murder I did was the execution of a rogue. The conspiracy I scattered was one that would have made a net in which to take you. The deceits I have put upon the Marquis Theodore, chiefly when I made him serve my dear Lord Ficino's turn and seduced him into occupying Vercelli, so as subsequently to afford the Duke of Milan a sound reason for moving against him, were deceits employed against a deceiver, whom it would be idle to combat in honest fashion. In his eyes more than any others, for he is not the only victim of the duplicity I have used to place you ultimately where you should be, I am a double-dealing Judas. And it is said of me, too, that in the field as in the council, I prevail by subterfuge and never by straightforward blows. But my conscience remains tranquil. It is not what a man does or says that counts, but what a man intends. I have embraced as a part of my guiding philosophy that teaching of Plato's which discriminates between the lie on the lips and the lie in the heart. On my lips and in my actions lies have been employed. I confess it frankly. But in my heart no lie has ever been. If I have employed at times dishonest means, at least the purpose for which they have been employed has been unfalteringly, unswervingly honest, and one in the final achievement of which there can be only pride and a sense of duty done. To this if you believe it, and the facts will presently constrain you to do so, unless my fortune in the field should presently desert me, I need add no details of the many steps in your service. By the light of faith in me from what is written and what is presently to do, you will now read aright those details for yourself. We touch now the goal whither all these efforts have been addressed. Upon this follows his concise account of the events from the moment of his escape from Quinto, and upon that an injunction to her to come at once with her brother to Casale. Depending upon the protection of his arm and the loyalty of a people which only awaits the sight of its rightful prince to be increased to enthusiasm and active support. That letter was dispatched next day to Quinto, but it did not reach her until almost a week later between Alessandria and Casale. Meanwhile early on the morrow the city was thrown into alarm by the approach of a strong body of horse. This was Ugolino de Tenda's condotta, and Ugolino himself rode in with a trumpeter to make renewed submission to the Lord Bellarion, and to give him news of what had happened in Quinto upon the coming of Barbaresco. Bellarion racked him with questions, as to what was said, particularly as to what the princess said and how she looked, and what passed between her and Carmagnola. And when all was done, far from the stern reproaches Ugolino had been expecting, he found himself embraced by a Bellarion more joyous than he had ever yet known that sardonic soldier. That gaiety of Bellarion's was observed by all in the days that followed. He was a man transformed. He displayed the light-heartedness of a boy, and moved about the many tasks claiming his attention with a song on his lips, a ready laugh upon the slightest occasion, and a sparkle in his great eyes that all had hitherto known so sombre. And this notwithstanding that these were busy and even anxious days of preparation for the final trial of strength. He rode abroad during the day with 2 or 3 of his officers, one of whom was always Stoffel, surveying the ground of the peninsula that lies between Sesia and Pa to the north of Casale. And at night he would labor over maps which he was preparing from his daily notes. Meanwhile he kept himself day by day informed, by means of a line of scouts which he had thrown out, of what was happening at Vercelli. With that clear prescience, which in all ages has been the gift of all great soldiers, he was able not merely to opine but quite definitely to state the course of action that Theodore would pursue. Because of this, on the Wednesday of that week, he moved Ugolino de Tenda and his condotta out of Casale, and transferred them bag and baggage, by night so that the movement might not be detected and reported to the enemy, to the woods about Trino, where they were ordered to encamp and to lie close until required. On the morning of Friday arrived at last in Casale the Marquis John Giacomo and his sister, escorted by the band of Montferrine exiles under Barbaresco and Casella, and the people turned out to welcome not only the princes, but in many cases their own relatives and friends. Bellarion, with his captains and a guard of honor of 50 lances, received the princes at the Lombard gate, and escorted them to the palace where their apartments had been prepared. The acclamations of the people lining the streets brought tears to the eyes of the princess and a flush to the cheeks of her brother. And there were tears in her eyes when she sought Bellarion in his room to abase herself in the admission of her grievous misjudgment and to sue pardon for it. "Your letter, sir," she told him, "touched me more deeply than anything I can remember in all my life. Think me a fool if you must for what is past, but not an ingrate. My brother shall prove our gratitude so soon as ever it lies within his power. Madonna, I ask no proofs of it, nor need them. To serve you has not been a means, but an end, as you shall see. That vision at least does not lie in the future. I see now, and very clearly." He smiled, a little wistfully, as he bowed to kiss her hand. "You shall see more clearly still," he promised her. That colloquy went no further. Stoffel broke in upon them to announce that his scouts had come galloping in from Vercelli with the news that the Lord Theodore had made a sally in force, shattering a way through Carmagnola's besiegers. And that he was advancing on Casale with a well-equipped army computed to be between 4,000 and 5,000 strong. The news had already spread about the city, and was causing amongst the people the gravest apprehension and unrest. The prospect of a siege and of the subsequent vengeance of the Lord Theodore upon the city for having harbored his enemies filled them with dread. "Send out trumpeters," Bellarion ordered, "and let it be proclaimed in every quarter that there will be no siege, and that the army is marching out at once to meet the Marquis Theodore beyond the Pa." 14. The Vanquished. Theodore's sally from Vercelli had been made at daybreak on that Friday morning. It had been shrewdly planned, for Theodore was no bungler, and, before he had brought more than half his men into action, Carmagnola, startled by the suddenness of the blow that fell upon him, was routed and in flight. After that, this being no more than the preliminary of the task before him, Theodore marched out every man of his following to go against Bellarion at Casale. Thus, by that ancient plan of attacking a vital point that had been left undefended, had Bellarion succeeded in drawing his enemy from a point of less importance in which he was almost impregnably entrenched. Theodore had perceived, as Bellarion had calculated that he would, that it could serve little purpose for him to hold an outpost like Vercelli if in the meantime the whole of his dominions were to be wrenched from his grasp. No sooner was he gone, however, than Carmagnola, informed of his departure, rallied his broken troops, and with drums beating, trumpets blaring, and flags flying, marched like a conqueror into the now undefended city of Vercelli. For the resistance it had made, he subjected it to a cruel sack, giving his men unbounded license, and that same evening he wrote to Duke Filippo Maria in the following terms. Most potent Duke and my good lord, it is my joyous task to give your highness tidings that, informed of the reduction in our numbers resulting from the defection of the Prince of Valsassina and several other captains acting in concert with him, the Lord Theodore of Montferrat, greatly presumptuous, did today issue from Vercelli for wager of battle against us. A vigorous action was fought in the neighborhood of Quinto, in which despite our inferior numbers we put the Marquis to flight. Lacking numbers sufficient to engage in pursuit, particularly as this would have led us into Montferrine territory, and since the reoccupation of Vercelli and its restoration to your duchy was the task with which your highness entrusted us, I marched into the city at once, and I now hold it in the name of your exalted potency. By this complete and speedy victory I hope to merit the approbation of your highness. Meanwhile Theodore's march on Casale had anything but the aspect of a flight. The great siege train he dragged along with him over the sodden and too yielding ground of that moist plain delayed his progress to such an extent that it was not until late on that November afternoon when he reached Villanova, here to receive news from his scouts that a considerable army, said to be commanded by the Prince of Valsassina, was circling northward from Terranova. The news was unexpected and brought with it some alarm. He had gone confidently and rather carelessly forward, fully expecting to find the enemy shut up in Casale. Hence all the ponderous siege train which had so hampered his progress. That Bellarion, forsaking the advantage of Casale's stout walls, should come out to meet him and engage him in the open was something beyond his dreams, and but for the unexpectedness of it, he would have rejoiced in such a decision on the part of his redoubtable opponent. It was in that unexpectedness, as usual, that lay Bellarion's advantage. Theodore, compelled now to act in haste, not knowing at what moment the enemy might be upon him, made dispositions to which it was impossible to give that thought which the importance of the issues demanded. The first of these was to order the men, who were preparing to encamp for the night, to be up again and to push on and out of this village before they found themselves hemmed into it. That circling movement reported suggested this danger to Theodore. They came out in rather straggling order to be marshalled even as they marched. Theodore's aim, and it was shrewd enough, was to reach the broad causeway of solid land between Corno and Popolo, where marshlands on either side would secure his flanks and compel the enemy to engage him on a narrow front. What was to follow he had not yet had time to consider. But if he could reach that objective, he would be secure for the present, and he could rest his men in the two hamlets on the marshes. But a mile beyond Villanova, Bellarion was upon his left flank and rear. He had little warning of it before the enemy was charging him. But it was warning enough. He threw out his line in a crescent formation, using his infantry in a manner which merited Bellarion's entire approval, and obviously intent upon fighting a rearguard battle whilst bringing his army to the coveted position. But the infantry were not equal to their commander, and they were insufficiently trained in these tactics. Some horses were piked, but almost every horse piked meant an opening in the human wall that opposed the charge, and through these openings Giasontrada's heavy riders broke in, swinging their ponderous maces. From a rearguard action on Theodore's part, the thing grew rapidly to the proportions of a general engagement, and for this Theodore could not have been placed worse than he was with his left, now that he had swung about. upon the quaking boglands of Dalmazzo and his back to the broad waters of the Po. He swung his troops farther round, so as to bring his rear upon the only possible line of retreat, which was that broad firm land between Corno and Populo. At last his skillful maneuvers achieved the desired result, and then, very gradually, fighting every inch of the ground, he began to fall back. At every yard now the front must grow narrower, and unless Bellarion's captains were very sure of their ground, some of them would presently be in trouble in the bogs on either side. If this did not happen, they would soon find it impossible, save at great cost and without perceptible progress, to continue the engagement, and with night approaching they would be constrained to draw off. Theodore smiled darkly to himself in satisfaction, and took heart, well pleased with his clever tactics by which he had extricated himself from a dangerous situation. He had won a breathing space that should enable him to marshal his men so as to deal with this rash enemy who came to seek him in the open. And then suddenly, a quarter-mile away, from the direction of Corno, towards which they were so steadily falling back, came a pounding of hoofs that swelled swiftly into a noise of thunder, and before any measures could be taken to meet this new menace, Ugolino de Tenda's horse was upon Theodore's rear. Ugolino had handled his condotta well, and strictly in accordance with his orders from Bellarion. From Balzola, whither he had been moved at noon so as to be in readiness, he had made a leisurely and cautious advance, filing his horse along the very edge of the bogland so that their hoofs should give no warning of their approach. Thus until he had won within striking distance. And the blow he now struck, heavy and unexpected, crumpled up Theodore's rear, clove through, driving his men right and left to sink to their waists in the marshes. And scattered such fear and confusion in those ahead that their formation went to pieces, and gaped to Bellarion's renewed frontal attacks. Less than 3 hours that engagement lasted, and of all those who had taken the field with Theodore, saving perhaps 1,000 who fled helter-skelter towards Trino after Ugolino's passage, there was not a survivor who had not yielded. Stripped of their arms and deprived of their horses, they were turned adrift, to go whithersoever they listed so long as it was outside of Montferrat territory. The maimed and wounded of Theodore's army were conveyed by their fellows into the villages of Villanova, Terranova, and Grassi. It was towards the 3rd hour of that November night when the triumphant army, returning from that stricken field, re-entered Casale, lighted by the bonfires that blazed in the streets. Whilst the bells of Liutprand's cathedral crashed out their peals of victory. Deliriously did the populace acclaim Bellarion, Prince of Valsassina, in its enormous relief at being saved the hardships of a siege and delivered from the possible vengeance of Theodore for having opened its gates to Theodore's enemies. Theodore, on foot, marched proudly at the head of a little band of captives of rank, who had been retained by their captors for the sake of the ransoms they could pay. The jostling, pushing crowd hooted and execrated and mocked him in his hour of humiliation. White-faced, his head held high, he passed on apparently unmoved by that expression of human baseness, knowing in his heart that, if he had proved master, the acclamations now raised for his conqueror would have been raised for him by the very lips that now execrated him. He was conducted to the palace, to the very room whence for so many years he had ruled the state of Montferrat, and there he found his nephew and niece awaiting him when he was brought in between Ugolino de Tenda and Giasone Trotta. Bareheaded, stripped of his armor, his tall figure bowed, he stood like a criminal before them whilst they remained seated on either side of the writing table that once had been his own. From the seat whence he had dispensed justice was justice now to be dispensed to him by his nephew. "You know your offense, my lord," John Giacomo greeted him, a cold, dignified, and virile John Giacomo, in whom it was hardly possible to recognize the boy whom he had sought to ruin in body and in soul. "You know how you have been false to the trust reposed in you by my father, to whom God give peace. Have you anything to say in extenuation?" He parted his lips, then stood there opening and closing his hands before he could sufficiently control himself to answer. "In the hour of defeat, what can I do but cast myself upon your mercy? Are we to pity you in defeat? Are we to forget in what you have been defeated? I ask not that. I am in your hands, a captive, helpless. I do not claim mercy. I may not deserve it. I hope for it. That is all. They considered him, and found him a broken man, indeed. "It is not for me to judge you," said John Giacomo, "and I am glad to be relieved of that responsibility. For though you may have forgotten that I am of your blood, I cannot forget that you are of mine. Where is His Highness of Valsassina?" Theodore fell back a pace. "Will you set me at the mercy of that dastard?" The Princess Valeria looked at him coldly. "He has won many titles since the day when to fight a villainy he pretended to become your spy. But the title you have just conferred upon him, coming from your lips, is the highest he has yet received. To be a dastard in the sight of a dastard is to be honorable in the sight of all upright men." Theodore's white face writhed into a smile of malice. But he answered nothing in the little pause that followed before the door opened upon Bellarion. He came in supported by two of his Swiss, and closely followed by Stoffel. His armor had been removed, and the right sleeve of his leather hacqueton, as of the silken tunic and shirt beneath, had been ripped up, and now hung empty at his side, whilst his breast bulged where his arm was strapped to his body. He was very pale and obviously weak and in pain. Valeria came to her feet at sight of him thus, and her face was whiter than his own. "You are wounded, my lord." He smiled, rather whimsically. "It sometimes happens when men go to battle. But I think my Lord Theodore here has taken the deeper hurt." Stoffel pushed forward a chair, and the Swiss carefully lowered Bellarion to it. He sighed in relief, and leaned forward so as to avoid contact with the back. "One of your knights, my lord, broke my shoulder in the last charge. I would he had broken your neck. That was the intention." Bellarion's pale lips smiled. "But I am known as Bellarion the Fortunate." "Just now my lord had another name for you," said Valeria, and Bellarion, observing the set of her lips and the scorn in her glance as it flickered over Theodore, marveled at the power of hate in one naturally so gracious. He had had a taste of it, himself, he remembered, and perhaps she was but passing on to Theodore what rightly had belonged to him throughout. "He is a rash man," she continued, "who will not trouble to conciliate the arbiter of his fate. My Lord Theodore has lost his guile, I think, together with the rest." "Aye," said Bellarion, "we have stripped him of all save his life. Even his mask of benignity is gone." "You are noble," said Theodore. "You gird at a captive. Am I to remain here to be mocked?" "Not for me, faith," Bellarion answered him. "I have never contemplated you with any pleasure. Take him away, Ugolino. Place him securely under guard. He shall have judgment tomorrow." "Dog!" said Theodore with venom, as he drew himself up to depart. "That's my device, as yours is the stag. Appropriate, all things considered. I had you in my mind when I adopted it." "I am punished for my weakness," said Theodore. "I should have left justice to wring your neck when you were its prisoner here in Casale." "I'll repay the debt," Bellarion answered him. "Your own neck shall remain unwrung so that you withdraw to your principality of Genoa and abide there. More of that tomorrow." Peremptorily he waved him away and Ugolino hustled him out. As the door closed again, Bellarion, relaxing the reins of his will, sank forward in a swoon. 15. The Last Fight. When he recovered, he was lying on his sound side on a couch under the window, across which the curtains of painted and gilded leather had been drawn. An elderly, bearded man in black was observing him, and someone whom he could not see was bathing his brow with a cool aromatic liquid. As he fetched a sigh that filled his lungs and quickened his senses into full consciousness, the man smiled. "There. It will be well with him now. But he should be put to bed." "It shall be done," said the woman who was bathing his brow, and her voice, soft and subdued, was the voice of the Princess Valeria. "His servants will be below by now. Send them to me as you go." The man bowed and went out. Slowly Bellarion turned his head, and looked up in wonder at the princess with whom he was now alone. Her eyes, more liquid than their wont, smiled wistfully down upon him. "Madonna!" he exclaimed. "Do you serve me as a handmaid?" "That is not You are thinking it an insufficient return for your service to me. But you must give me time, sir, this is only a beginning. I am not thinking that at all. Then you are not thinking as you should. You are weak. Your wits work slowly. Else you might remember that for 5 years, in which you have been my loyal, noble, unswerving friend, I, immured in my stupidity, have been your enemy. Ah! He smiled. I knew I should convince you in the end. Such knowledge gives us patience. A man may contain his soul for anything that is assured. It is the doubtful only that makes him fret and fume. And you never doubted? She asked him, wondering. I am too sure of myself, he answered. And God knows you have cause to be, more cause than any man of whom ever I heard tell. Do you know, Lord Prince, that in these 5 years there is no evil I have not believed of you? I even deemed you a coward, on the word of that vain boaster Carmagnola. He was none so wrong, by his own lights. I am not a fighter of his pattern. I have ever been careful of myself. Your condition now proves that. Oh, this, today. That was different. Too much depended on the issue. It was the last throw. I had to take a hand, much though I dislike a rough and tumble. So that we won through, it would not much have mattered if the vamp-blade of that fellow's lance had brought up against my throat. There are no more fights for me, so what matter if I left my life in the last one? The last one, Lord Prince. And that is not my title any more. I am a prince no longer. I leave the rank behind with all the other vanities of the world. You leave it behind? She found him obscure. When I go back to Sigliano, which will be as soon as I can move. What do you go to do at Sigliano? What? Why, what the other brethren do. Pax multa in cella. The old abbot was right. There is yonder a peace for which I am craving now that my one task here is safely ended. In the world there is nothing for me. Nothing. She was amazed. And in 5 years you have won so much. Nothing that I covet, he answered gently. It is all vanity, all madness, greed, and bloodlust. I was not made for worldliness, and but for you I should never have known it. Now I have done. And your dominions, Gavi and Valsassina? I'll bestow them upon you, Madonna, if you will deign to accept a parting gift from these hands. There was a long pause. She had drawn back a little. He could not see her face. You have the fever, I think, she said presently in an odd voice. It is your hurt. He sighed. You would think so. It is difficult for one reared in the world to understand that a man's eyes should remain undazzled by its glitter. Yet, believe me, I leave it with but one regret. And that? The question came breathlessly upon a whisper. That the purpose for which I entered it remains unfulfilled. That I have learnt no Greek. Again there was a pause. Then she moved forward, rustling a little, and came directly into his line of vision. I hear your servants, I think. I will leave you now. I thank you, Madonna. God be with you. But she did not go. She stood there between himself and the fireplace, slight and straight as on the first evening when he had seen her in her garden. She was dressed in a close-fitting gown of cloth of silver. He observed in particular now the tight sleeves which descended to the knuckles of her slim, tapering hands, and remembered that just such sleeves had she worn when first his eyes beheld her. Over this gown she wore a loose houppelande of sapphire velvet, reversed at throat and wide gaping sleeves with ermine. And there were sapphires in the silver caul that confined her abundant red-gold hair. He said wistfully, dreamily, it was just so you looked, and just so will I remember you as long as I remember anything. It is good to have served you, lady mine. It has made me glorious in my own eyes. You have made yourself glorious, Lord Prince, in the eyes of all. What do they matter? Slowly she came back to him. She was very pale and a little frown was puckering her fine brows. Very wistful, and mysterious as deep pools, were those dark eyes of hers. She came back, drawn by the words he had used, and more than the words, by something odd in his gently musing tone. Do I matter nothing, Bellarion? He smiled with an infinite sadness. Must you ask that now? Does not the whole of my life in the world give you the answer, that never woman mattered more to a man? I have known no service but yours. And I have served you, per fas iti nefas. She stood above him, and her lips quivered. What she said when at last she spoke had no apparent bearing upon the subject. I am wearing your colors, Bellarion. Surprise flickered in his eyes, as they sought confirmation of her statement in the azure and argent of her wear. And I did not remark the chance, he cried. Not chance. It is design. It was sweetly and generously courteous so to honor me. It was not only to honor you that I assumed these colors. Have they no message for you, Bellarion? Message? For the first time in their acquaintance she saw fear in his bold eyes. Clearly they have not, no message that you look for. You have said that you covet nothing in this world. Nothing within my reach. To covet things beyond it is to taste the full bitterness of life. Is there anything in the world that is not within your reach, Bellarion? He looked at her as she smiled down upon him through her tears. He caught his breath gaspingly. With his sound left hand he clutched her left, which hung at the level of his head. I am mad, of course, he choked. Not mad, Bellarion. Only stupid. Do you still covet nothing? One thing. His face glowed. One thing that would change into a living glory the tinsel glitter of the world, one thing that would make life. Oh God! What am I saying? Why do you break off, Bellarion? I am afraid. Of me? Is there anything I could deny you, who have given all to serve me? Must I in return offer you all I have? Can you claim nothing for yourself? Valeria. She stooped to kiss his lips. My very hate of you in all these years was love dissembled. Because my spirit leapt to yours, almost from that first evening in the garden there, did it so wound and torture me to discover baseness in you. I should have trusted my own heart, rather than my erring senses, Bellarion. You warned me early that I am not good at inference. I have suffered as those suffer who are in rebellion against themselves. He pondered her, very pale and sorrowful. Yes, he said slowly, I have the fever, as you said a while ago. It must be that. The end.